The gavel struck like a death sentence in the dusty courthouse of Ironwood Crossing. Margaret Hale stood in widow's black, her knuckles white against the rail as Judge Morrison's words sealed her fate. By territorial law you will marry Jonas Reed within the week, or forfeit everything your late husband left behind. The brooding gunslinger in the corner lifted his scarred face, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart stumble. This is a story of forced vows that became chosen love, of a kiss that changed everything. Stay with me until the end and comment your city below. I'd love to know how far this prairie tale has traveled. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the courthouse steps as Margaret Hale emerged into the harsh light of her new reality. 3 days. 3 days since they'd lowered Sheriff Thomas Hale into the ground, and already the vultures had descended. Not the carrion birds that wheeled over the prairie, but the humankind, the ones who wore suits and carried law books instead of guns. Mrs. Hale, Judge Morrison's reedy voice followed her out. You have 48 hours to make your decision. The law is clear. Margaret didn't turn around. She couldn't bear to look at his watery eyes, so full of false sympathy. The law. Always the law. As if words written by men who'd never set foot in Ironwood Crossing could dictate the course of her life. I buried my husband 3 days ago, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. 3 days, Judge. I understand your grief, but do you? She spun around then, her green eyes blazing with a fury that made the old judge take a step back. Do you understand what it's like to wash your husband's blood from the floorboards? To hold his hand as the life drains from his eyes? To stand before a town that expects you to be grateful they're allowing you to keep what's rightfully yours, but only if you spread your legs for another man? The crude words hung in the air between them, shocking in their bluntness. Several townspeople who'd gathered on the courthouse steps gasped. Margaret didn't care. Propriety was a luxury she could no longer afford. Now, Mrs. Hale, Morrison stammered, his face flushing red. There's no need for such language. The territorial statute is designed to protect women like yourself. A woman alone trying to run a ranch. I've been running that ranch for 5 years while Thomas kept the peace in this town, Margaret interrupted. I know every head of cattle, every acre of grazing land, every stream and gulch, but because I lack what's between a man's legs, suddenly I'm incapable? Jonas Reed shifted where he leaned against the courthouse wall, his presence a dark shadow in Margaret's peripheral vision. She'd noticed him throughout the proceedings, though he'd said nothing. The town's chosen candidate for her next husband. A drifter who'd arrived in Ironwood Crossing 6 months ago, working odd jobs, keeping to himself. The scars on his face and hands told stories that his silence kept buried. Mr. Reed has agreed to the arrangement, Judge Morrison said, gesturing toward Jonas. He's a capable man, strong. He'll provide protection, and he's agreed. Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. How generous of him. And what exactly has Mr. Reed been promised in exchange for his sacrifice? My ranch? My cattle? My body? Jonas pushed off from the wall, his boots heavy on the wooden planks as he approached. When he spoke, his voice was low, gravelly, as if he didn't use it often. I've been promised nothing, Mrs. Hale, except a chance to stop running. She studied him then, really looked at him for the first time. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a day's worth of stubble shadowing his jaw. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw was still pink in places, not fully healed. There were other marks, too. A web of them across his knuckles, a puckered wound visible just above his collar. This was a man who'd lived through violence and bore its signature on his skin. Running from what? She asked. His dark eyes held hers. Same thing we're all running from, I reckon. The things we've done, the things we couldn't stop. There was something in his voice, a weariness that matched her own. Margaret felt her anger falter for a moment before she steeled herself again. She couldn't afford compassion, not now. I don't need your protection, Mr. Reed. I don't need anyone's protection. Maybe not, he said, but the law says different. And in my experience, fighting the law in a place like this is like fighting the wind. You'll wear yourself out and it'll keep blowing just the same. Judge Morrison cleared his throat. Mr. Reed speaks sense, Mrs. Hale. This is the best solution for everyone involved. You keep your ranch, Mr. Reed gets a fresh start, and the town gets to pretend they're civilized while forcing a widow into bed with a stranger. Margaret finished. Yes, Judge. I understand perfectly. She turned to Jonas. And you? You're comfortable with this arrangement? Marrying a woman who doesn't want you, taking what isn't freely given? Something flickered across his face, pain perhaps, or shame. I've done worse things, Mrs. Hale. At least this time I can try to do right by someone. Do right? She stepped closer to him, close enough to smell the leather and tobacco scent of him, close enough to see that his eyes weren't black as she'd thought, but a deep brown with flecks of gold. There's nothing right about any of this. No, he agreed quietly. There isn't. But sometimes wrong is all we got to work with. The crowd around them had grown. Margaret recognized faces. Mrs. Patterson from the general store, whispering behind her hand to Mrs. Clement. Bob Turner from the saloon, leering with undisguised interest. The Murphy brothers, who'd been circling her ranch like coyotes since Thomas died, their expressions dark with disappointment that they wouldn't be getting their hands on her land. 48 hours, Mrs. Hale, Judge Morrison repeated. The ceremony will take place Thursday at noon, here at the courthouse. Unless. He paused, seeming to gather his courage. Unless you prefer to sign over the deed to the territory and relocate. There's a widow's house in Denver, I'm told. Very respectable. A widow's house. A place where discarded women went to slowly fade away, dependent on charity, their spirits broken along with their circumstances. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. I'll die before I give up my land, she said, her voice carrying across the square. That ranch is mine. Thomas and I built it with our own hands, bled for it, nearly starved that first winter protecting it. And you think I'll hand it over to these vultures? She gestured at the Murphy brothers. Or slink away to Denver to live on scraps of pity. Then you'll marry, Morrison said simply. Those are your only choices. Margaret looked at Jonas again. He stood quietly, his hands loose at his sides, but she noticed the way his fingers twitched slightly, as if ready to reach for a gun that wasn't there. A gunslinger's instinct. What had this man done? What blood was on those scarred hands? Tell me something, Mr. Reed, she said. That scar on your face? How'd you get it? His jaw tightened. Does it matter? If I'm to bind myself to you before God and law, I'd like to know what kind of man I'm getting. The kind who's still breathing when other men aren't, he said flatly. That's all you need to know. A killer, then. The whispers she'd heard were true. Jonas Reed had arrived in Ironwood Crossing with blood on his hands and shadows in his past, and this was the man the town had chosen for her. I need time to put my affairs in order, Margaret said to the judge. If I'm to be sold like cattle, at least give me the dignity of preparing for it. Thursday, noon, Morrison repeated. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Mrs. Hale. Margaret turned without another word and walked toward her horse, a bay mare Thomas had given her 3 years ago. Her hands shook as she untied the reins from the hitching post. She could feel eyes on her, the town's, the judge's, and most of all, Jonas Reed's. Those dark eyes that seemed to see too much, understand too much. She'd mounted and turned the horse toward home when Jonas spoke again, his voice carrying just far enough for her to hear. I'm sorry about Thomas, Mrs. Hale. He was a good man. Margaret paused, looking back at him. You knew my husband? He gave me work when no one else would. Didn't ask questions about the scars or the guns, just asked if I could mend fence and work cattle. Jonas's expression softened slightly. He talked about you. Said you were the strongest woman he'd ever known. Said the ranch would be nothing without you. The unexpected kindness in his words, the mention of Thomas, threatened to break through the wall of anger Margaret had built around herself. She couldn't afford to cry, not here, not in front of these people who were already treating her like a commodity to be traded. If you respected my husband, she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion, you'd refuse this arrangement. Jonas was quiet for a moment. Then, if I refuse, they'll just find someone worse. At least with me, you know what you're getting. A man who'll work the land, protect what's yours, and leave you be otherwise. Leave me be? She laughed bitterly. We both know what marriage entails, Mr. Reed. The law gives a husband certain rights. His face darkened. I've never taken anything from a woman that wasn't freely given, Mrs. Hale. I don't intend to start now. She wanted to believe him. Something in his eyes, in the set of his shoulders, suggested he meant what he said. But she'd learned long ago that men's promises were worth less than prairie dust. Thursday, then, she said, and spurred her horse toward home. The ride to the ranch took her through the heart of Ironwood Crossing, past the saloon where Thomas had spent so many evenings keeping the peace, past the school where she'd once taught before marrying, past the church where they'd exchanged vows 8 years ago. 8 years. It seemed like a lifetime and yesterday, all at once. The town was changing, growing. The railroad was coming through next year, they said, bringing prosperity and civilization. Thomas had been excited about it, talking about how their ranch would be perfectly positioned to supply beef to the railway workers. Now he'd never see it. As she rode past the general store, she caught sight of her reflection in the window. A woman of 28, though she felt decades older. Her blonde hair, once her pride, was pulled back severely, hidden beneath a black bonnet. Her face, Thomas had always said, was like a cameo, delicate features that belied her strength. But strength wasn't enough anymore. Not in a world where the law could strip everything from her simply because she'd been born a woman. The ranch came into view as she crested the last hill. 500 acres stretching toward the mountains, with good water from Willow Creek running through it. The house Thomas had built for her, 2 stories of solid timber with a wraparound porch and real glass windows shipped from Denver. The barn, the corrals, the bunkhouse for the hands. Everything they'd dreamed of, everything they'd built together. Pete Rodriguez, their foreman, was waiting by the gate, his weathered face creased with concern as she approached. "How did it go, Mrs. Hale?" She dismounted, handing him the reins. "As expected. I have 2 days to accept their terms or lose everything." Pete cursed in Spanish, then apologized. Thomas would have shot them all for suggesting such a thing. "Thomas isn't here," Margaret said wearily. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" "The boys and we've been talking," Pete said, following her toward the house. "We could make a stand. Nobody's taking this ranch while we're here." Margaret stopped, touched by his loyalty. Pete had been with them since the beginning, had helped them through that brutal first winter when they'd nearly lost everything to cold and starvation. "And then what, Pete?" "They'd send the cavalry from Fort Morgan. You'd all be arrested or killed and I'd lose the ranch anyway." She shook her head. "No, I won't have more blood spilled over this." "So you'll marry this Reed fellow?" "It seems I have no choice." Pete spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "I've seen him around town. Keeps to himself mostly. Good with horses, from what I hear. But there's something dark about him, Mrs. Hale. The kind of man who's got graves behind him." "Then he'll fit right in with the rest of Ironwood Crossing," Margaret said bitterly. "Half the men in this town have blood on their hands from the war, or the Indian fights, or just plain meanness." Thomas wasn't like that. "No," she agreed softly. "Thomas wasn't like that." She entered the house, the familiar scent of wood polish and the lingering aroma of this morning's coffee wrapping around her like a ghost's embrace. Everything was exactly as Thomas had left it. His coffee cup still sat on the kitchen table, his muddy boots by the door, his rifle above the mantel. Margaret walked to their bedroom, her bedroom now, and sat on the bed. The wedding quilt her mother had made lay across it, each square telling a story of her life before Thomas, before the West, before she knew that love could be both a blessing and a curse. She pulled out the letter she'd been avoiding, the one that had arrived yesterday from Thomas's sister in Boston. "Dearest Margaret," it read, "we were devastated to hear of Thomas's passing. Please know that you are welcome here. Boston may not be the frontier, but it has opportunities for a woman of your education and refinement. You could teach again or perhaps work in one of the ladies' shops. It would be a respectable life. Away from the violence and hardship of the territories. A respectable life. Safe. Comfortable. Dead inside." Margaret crumpled the letter and threw it into the fireplace. She'd rather marry a scarred gunslinger than retreat to Boston with her tail between her legs. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She found Jake Murphy standing on her porch, hat in hand, trying to look respectful despite the calculation in his eyes. "Mrs. Hale," he began, "I heard about the judge's ruling. I wanted to offer an alternative. Unless your alternative involves the judge dropping dead and the law changing overnight, I'm not interested, Mr. Murphy." He smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Actually, it does involve the law. You see, the statute says you must remarry, but it doesn't specify that you have to marry Jonas Reed. That was just the judge's suggestion." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Go on." "Marry me instead." He stepped closer, and she could smell the whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. "I've got land adjoining yours. Together, we'd have the biggest spread in the county. You know cattle, I know the business side. It would be a partnership." "A partnership," she repeated flatly. "That's right. Of course, there would be wifely duties involved." His gaze traveled over her body in a way that made her skin crawl. "But I'm sure we could come to an understanding. You're a beautiful woman, Margaret. Thomas was a lucky man." "Get off my porch, Mr. Murphy." His false friendliness vanished. "You think you're too good for me? You'd rather spread your legs for that scarred killer than for a respectable rancher?" Margaret's hand moved to the doorframe where Thomas always kept a loaded shotgun. She had it aimed at Jake's chest before he could blink. "Thomas taught me to shoot when we first came here," she said calmly. "I can take the eye out of a rabbit at 50 yards. At this distance, I don't think I'd miss something as large as your gut. Now get off my land before I decide to test my aim." Jake backed away, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You're making a mistake, Margaret. Reed's got blood on his hands, the kind of blood that don't wash off. You marry him, and you're inviting death into your bed." "Then death and I will be well matched," she said, "since it's already taken everything I love." She watched him ride away, the shotgun still steady in her hands. Only when he was out of sight did she allow herself to lower it, her arms trembling with delayed reaction. That night, she sat by the fire, going through the ranch's books. They were doing well, better than well. The cattle were healthy, the contracts with the army fort were solid, and they'd finally paid off the loan from the bank. Thomas had been so proud when they'd made that last payment. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Pete entered, hat in hand. "Sorry to disturb you, ma'am, but there's someone here to see you." Margaret's hand went to the pistol she'd taken to keeping close. "Who?" "It's Reed, ma'am. Says he needs to speak with you." She found Jonas standing in the yard, his horse tied to the porch rail. In the moonlight, the scar on his face seemed deeper, more pronounced. He'd cleaned up some, shaved, put on what looked like his best shirt, though it was still worn at the elbows. "Mr. Reed," she said coolly, "it's rather late for social calls." "I apologize, Mrs. Hale, but I figured we should talk before Thursday. Set some things straight between us." "What's there to set straight?" "The town has decided, the law has spoken. We're to be married whether either of us wants it or not." He shifted uncomfortably. "That's just it. I want you to know, I didn't ask for this. I didn't come to Morrison or anyone else looking to claim your ranch." "Then why agree to it?" Jonas was quiet for a moment, looking out over the moonlit prairie. "You ever been hunted, Mrs. Hale?" The question caught her off guard. "Hunted?" "Had men on your trail. Known that every town you enter might be the one where they catch up. Sleeping with one eye open, hand on your gun, wondering if today's the day your past comes calling." "No," she said softly. "I haven't. I have. For 3 years now, this marriage, this ranch, it offers something I haven't had in a long time. A reason to stop running, a place to make a stand if they come." He looked at her then, and she saw something vulnerable in his eyes. "I know that's not fair to you. Bringing my troubles to your door, but Morrison made it clear, if I didn't agree, they'd find someone else. Someone like Jake Murphy." "Jake was here earlier," Margaret said, "making his own offer." Jonas's jaw tightened. "And?" "I introduced him to Thomas's shotgun." The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been approval. "Thomas said you were formidable." "You talked to Thomas about me?" "He talked. I listened. Man was proud of you, said you could run this ranch better than any man in the county." Jonas paused. "He also said you deserved better than this life." better than the loneliness and the struggle. Thomas was a romantic, Margaret said, her throat tight. He saw the world as it should be, not as it was. Maybe, but he saw you clear enough, and he'd hate what's happening now. Yes, she agreed. He would. They stood in silence for a moment, the night sounds of the prairie surrounding them, crickets, a distant coyote, the wind through the grass. I meant what I said earlier, Jonas said finally, about not taking what isn't given. We can be married in law without being married in truth. Separate rooms. You run the ranch as you see fit. I'll work the land, help with the cattle, fix what needs fixing. But your life, your choices, those stay yours. And if your past comes calling, these men who hunt you, his face hardened, then I'll deal with it away from here. I won't bring violence to your door. Violence has already been to my door, Mr. Reed. It took my husband. I don't fear it anymore. He studied her for a long moment. No, I don't believe you do. What did you do? She asked suddenly. To have men hunting you for 3 years, what did you do? Jonas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I killed the wrong man's son. Margaret waited, knowing there was more. Self-defense, though that doesn't matter to his father. The boy Drew first was drunk and mean and looking for a reputation. He found a grave instead. His father owns half of Kansas, has money and men, and a long memory. Jonas touched the scar on his face unconsciously. This was a reminder from the first group he sent. I've been moving west ever since, trying to stay ahead of them. And you think marrying me, settling here, will keep you safe? No, but it might give me something worth fighting for when they come. A man with nothing to lose is easy to kill. A man protecting something, someone, he's dangerous. The honesty in his words surprised her. This wasn't a man trying to deceive her or paint himself as a hero. He was laying his cards on the table, ugly as they were. Thursday, then, she said. We'll do what must be done. But understand this, Mr. Reed, Jonas. This ranch is mine. Thomas and I built it, and I'll not have it taken from me. Not by the law, not by the town, and not by you. Understood, ma'am. Margaret, she said, if we're to maintain this charade, you should probably call me Margaret. He nodded. Margaret. The way he said her name, soft and careful, as if it was something fragile, made her stomach tighten unexpectedly. She pushed the feeling aside. There's a room over the barn, she said. It's clean, has a bed and a stove. You can stay there. That's generous, considering. It's practical. If we're to convince the town this marriage is real, you can't be staying at the boarding house. Jonas moved toward his horse, then paused. For what it's worth, Margaret, I'm sorry. About Thomas, about this situation, about all of it. You deserve better. We all deserve better than what we get, Jonas. The trick is making do with what we have. She watched him lead his horse toward the barn, his figure disappearing into the darkness. In 2 days, that stranger would be her husband. The thought should have terrified her, or at least angered her. Instead, she felt oddly numb, as if she was watching someone else's life from a great distance. Back in the house, she stood before the mirror in her bedroom, still wearing her widow's black. In 2 days, she'd be expected to put it aside, to dress as a bride for her forced wedding. The thought made her sick. She pulled out her wedding dress from her marriage to Thomas, stored carefully in tissue paper. It was simple but beautiful, ivory silk with pearl buttons that Thomas had special ordered from San Francisco. She'd been so happy that day, so full of hope for the future. Now that future was gone, buried with Thomas in the cemetery on the hill. Margaret put the dress away and pulled out a plain gray dress instead. She wouldn't mock her real wedding by wearing white for this farce. Let the town gossip. They would anyway. The next morning brought a steady stream of visitors, each with their own opinion about her situation. Mrs. Patterson from the general store came by with a cake, chattering about how fortunate Margaret was that such a strong man had agreed to marry her. Of course, there are those stories about his past, Mrs. Thad, Patterson said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, but I'm sure they're exaggerated. And really, dear, at your age and in your situation, you can't afford to be particular. Margaret wanted to throw the cake in the woman's face, but instead smiled tightly and thanked her for her kindness. Reverend Mills came by in the afternoon, offering spiritual guidance that amounted to reminding her of her wifely duties and the importance of submission to her husband's will. "God works in mysterious ways, Mrs. Hale," he intoned. "Perhaps this marriage is his plan for you, a chance for renewal and redemption." "Redemption from what, Reverend? Being a widow?" He flushed. "From the sin of pride, perhaps. A woman alone thinking she can run a ranch, make decisions meant for men. It goes against the natural order." "The natural order," Margaret repeated. "Tell me, Reverend, when God made the prairie, did he intend for it to care whether the hands that worked it belonged to a man or a woman? When he made cattle, did he design them to only respond to a male voice? You're being deliberately obtuse, Mrs. Hale. I'm being realistic, Reverend. And if God wanted me to be submissive and weak, he wouldn't have given me the strength to survive out here." The Reverend left shortly after, clearly disapproving of her attitude. Margaret didn't care. She had bigger concerns than the opinion of a man who'd never worked a day of physical labor in his life. As the sun began to set, she walked up the hill to Thomas's grave. It was still fresh, the earth barely settled. She'd ordered a headstone from Denver, but it wouldn't arrive for weeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the mound of dirt. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I have to do this. I'm sorry for all of it." The wind picked up, rustling through the grass, and for a moment she could almost imagine it was Thomas's voice, telling her to be strong, to do what she must to survive. "He's not you," she continued. "This Jonas Reed, he's darkness where you were light. But maybe that's what I need now. Someone who understands that the world is cruel and doesn't pretend otherwise." A sound made her turn. Jonas stood a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said. "I was checking the fence line and saw you up here." "It's fine." She looked back at Thomas's grave. "Did you mean it? When you said he was a good man?" "I did. Best sheriff this town ever had. Fair, honest, treated everyone with respect, even drifters with suspicious scars." "He was killed by a drunk cowboy," Margaret said, the words bitter in her mouth. "All that goodness, all that fairness, and he was shot by a boy who couldn't hold his liquor and thought killing a sheriff would make him famous. The boy? Dead. Thomas managed to return fire before—" She trailed off. 17 years old. What a waste. Jonas moved to stand beside her, maintaining a careful distance. "Death usually is. How many men have you killed?" The question came out before she could stop it. He was quiet for a moment. "Enough to know it solves less than you'd think." "But you'd do it again, if those men hunting you found you." "Yes," he said simply, "to survive, to protect what matters, yes." "And what matters to you, Jonas Reed?" He looked at her then, his dark eyes unreadable in the fading light. "I'm still figuring that out." They stood together in silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Tomorrow would be her last day as Margaret Hale, widow of Sheriff Thomas Hale. The day after, she'd become Margaret Reed, wife of a gunslinger with blood on his hands and shadows in his past. "The hands are wondering about you," she said finally. "Whether you'll be taking over as foreman." "Pete's your foreman. I'm just another hand as far as I'm concerned." "The town won't see it that way. They'll expect you to take charge, to be the man of the house." "The town can expect whatever it wants. This is your ranch, Margaret. That won't change because of some words said over a Bible." She studied him in the dying light. "Most men wouldn't see it that way." "I'm not most men." "No," she agreed. "You're not." That night, Margaret lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine what her life would be like in 2 days. Would Jonas keep his word? Would he truly leave her be? Or would the isolation and proximity eventually erode his promises? And even if he kept his distance, how long before his past caught up with them? How long before she was burying another husband? The questions churned in her mind until exhaustion finally pulled her into a fitful sleep, where she dreamed of Thomas calling her name across an endless prairie, always too far away to reach. Wednesday dawned gray and drizzling, as if the sky itself was mourning what was to come. Margaret spent the morning going over the books with Pete, making sure he understood that nothing would change in how the ranch operated. "You're still the boss, ma'am," Pete assured her. "Son, The boys understand that. Anyone has a problem with it, they can find work elsewhere. And Jonas? What do the men think of him? Pete shrugged. He keeps to himself mostly, works hard when he's hired on for day labor, knows his way around horses and cattle. But there's something about him that makes folks nervous, the way he watches everything, like he's waiting for trouble. Maybe he is. Maybe. But trouble has a way of finding men like that, whether they're waiting for it or not. That afternoon, Margaret rode into town for supplies, needing to keep her hands busy to avoid thinking about tomorrow. The general store was crowded, conversation stopping when she entered. She could feel the weight of their stares, hear the whispers that started as soon as they thought she was out of earshot. Poor thing, she heard Mrs. Clement murmur. Having to marry that gunslinger, but what choice does she have? Better than losing the ranch, Mrs. Patterson replied. And who knows? Maybe she'll civilize him. Margaret wanted to laugh at that, as if she had any interest in civilizing anyone. She just wanted to be left alone to run her ranch and grieve her husband in peace. But peace, it seemed, was a luxury the law wouldn't allow her. She was loading her supplies when she noticed Jonas at the blacksmith's, having his horse reshod. He caught her eye and nodded, a simple acknowledgement that somehow felt like solidarity. Tomorrow they would be bound together by law, two unwilling participants in a forced union. Tonight, they were still strangers, preparing for a future neither wanted. As she rode home, the drizzle turned to rain, soaking through her coat. The ranch looked different in the gray light, less like home and more like a prison. But it was her prison, and she'd fight to keep it. That evening, Jonas came to the house for dinner at her invitation. They needed to discuss practical matters, how they would present themselves to the town, what story they would tell, how they would maintain the fiction of a real marriage while living separate lives. People will expect us to share a bedroom, Margaret said bluntly as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table. At least at first. Jonas nodded. We can move my things into the house for appearances. I'll sleep on the floor if needed. There's a daybed in Thomas's study. You can use that until the gossip dies down, then move back to the room over the barn. Sounds reasonable. They ate in silence for a while, the only sound the rain against the windows. Margaret had cooked a simple meal, beef stew and cornbread, nothing fancy. Jonas ate like a man who'd gone hungry before, steady and appreciative without being greedy. You cook well, he said. Thomas liked my cooking. The words slipped out before she could stop them, and grief hit her like a physical blow. She set down her spoon, her hands shaking. I'm sorry, Jonas said quietly. I know this must be unbearable, she supplied. Sitting here with a stranger, discussing how to pretend to be married while my real husband lies cold in the ground. Yes. His simple agreement, without platitudes or attempts to minimize her pain, somehow made it easier to bear. She took a breath, steadied herself. Tell me about yourself, she said. If we're to convince people this is real, I should know more than just your name and your reputation. Jonas pushed his stew around his bowl. Not much to tell. Born in Missouri, fought in the war, Union side. Drifted after that. Worked cattle, horses, whatever paid. Made some mistakes. Been paying for them since. Family? Dead. Parents died of fever when I was 15. Had a sister, but she died in childbirth a few years back. I'm sorry. He shrugged. Life out here isn't kind to anyone. No, she agreed. It's not. What about you? How'd you end up in Ironwood Crossing? Margaret found herself telling him about meeting Thomas when he was a deputy in Kansas City, how he'd courted her properly, won over her parents, how they decided to head west for opportunity and adventure, ending up in Ironwood Crossing when it was barely more than a trading post. We built this place from nothing, she said, looking around the kitchen. Every board, every nail, every fence post, we did it together. You'll keep building it, Jonas said, with or without me. With you, apparently. At least for now. For now, he agreed. They discussed the ceremony, brief, at the courthouse, with only the required witnesses. Margaret would wear the gray dress. Jonas had a clean shirt and vest that would suffice. No reception, no celebration. Just a legal transaction to satisfy the law. As Jonas prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Margaret, I want you to know something. If this gets too hard, if you decide you'd rather leave, go to Denver or back east. I won't stop you. I'll stay, work the ranch, send you the profits. You don't have to sacrifice everything for this place." She stared at him, surprised by the offer. "You'd do that? Stay here alone, married to a ghost, just so I could be free?" "Freedom's a precious thing. I wouldn't take it from anyone if I could help it." "And what about your freedom?" "Lost that a long time ago. The moment I pulled that trigger in Kansas, my choices narrowed down to running or dying. This," he gestured at the house, the ranch beyond, "this is more than I expected to have. It's a prison of a different kind." "Maybe, but it's a prison with purpose. That's more than I've had in years." After he left, Margaret sat by the dying fire, trying to reconcile the man she'd just shared dinner with, quiet, thoughtful, wounded, with the killer everyone whispered about. Perhaps they were both true. Perhaps everyone carried multiple selves inside them, and circumstances determined which one emerged. She thought about Thomas, how he'd been both the tough sheriff who faced down outlaws and the gentle husband who brought her wildflowers. Now she would be bound to a man who was both protector and threat, stranger and spouse. The rain continued through the night, drumming against the roof like a countdown to tomorrow. Margaret didn't sleep. Instead, she walked through the house, touching objects that held memories, the quilt her mother made, the books Thomas had ordered special from Denver, the coffee pot they'd bought their first Christmas together. By dawn, the rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming. Margaret dressed carefully in the gray dress, pinning her hair up severely. No veil, no flowers, no pretense that this was anything other than what it was, a business arrangement forced by unjust laws. Pete and the hands were gathered in the yard when she emerged. They'd cleaned up, put on their best clothes. "We're riding with you, ma'am," Pete said. "Witnesses or not, you shouldn't go alone." The loyalty in their eyes nearly broke her composure. These men who'd worked alongside her and Thomas, who'd stayed even after his death when they could have found easier work elsewhere. "Thank you," she managed. Jonas was waiting at the courthouse, looking uncomfortable in his clean clothes. The scar on his face seemed more prominent in the morning light, a reminder of the violence that followed him. But his eyes, when they met hers, held a steadiness that surprised her. Judge Morrison was already there, along with the required witnesses, the bank manager and the town clerk, both looking supremely uncomfortable. The Murphy brothers stood in the back, their faces dark with resentment. "Let's proceed," Morrison said, opening his Bible. The ceremony was brief, the words meaningless. Margaret heard them as if from a great distance. Honor, obey, cherish. Lies, all of it. When it came time for the ring, Jonas produced a simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "You don't have to wear it after today." But as he slipped it onto her finger, Margaret felt the weight of it like a shackle. This was real. She was no longer Margaret Hale. "You may kiss the bride," Morrison said. Jonas leaned in, his lips barely brushing her cheek, the gesture more respectful than romantic. But even that brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through her. Not desire, but something else. Recognition, perhaps. Two damaged souls recognizing each other across the wasteland of their circumstances. "It's done then," Morrison said, closing his Bible. "May God have mercy on you both." As they walked out of the courthouse, now legally bound, Margaret caught Jonas's arm. "We survived this," she said, low enough that only he could hear. "Whatever comes, your past, the town's judgment, all of it, we survive." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. "Yes," he said simply, "we survive." And so Margaret Hale became Margaret Reed, bound to a stranger by law and necessity, walking into an uncertain future with only her determination and his promises for protection. The ranch waited for them, unchanged by the morning's proceedings, and Margaret took comfort in that. The land didn't care about marriage or law or propriety. It only cared about strength, endurance, and the will to keep going when everything seemed lost. As they rode back to the ranch, her ranch, their ranch now, Margaret didn't look back at the town. There was nothing there for her now but gossip and judgment. Her life, whatever it would become, lay ahead, in the house Thomas built, with the man she'd been forced to marry, under the vast, indifferent sky of the frontier. The wedding was over. The real test was just beginning. The ride back from the courthouse stretched endlessly before them, each hoofbeat marking another second of their new reality. Margaret kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, acutely aware of Jonas riding beside her, the space between them filled with unspoken questions and uncomfortable truths. The ranch hands rode behind them in respectful silence, their presence both a comfort and a reminder that this marriage was now public knowledge, subject to scrutiny and speculation. When they finally reached the ranch, Margaret dismounted quickly, needing distance from the weight of what had just transpired. Jonas caught her elbow gently as she stumbled slightly, her legs unsteady from tension rather than the ride. "Steady," he said quietly, and she jerked away from his touch as if burned. "I'm fine," she said sharply, then caught herself. They had an audience. The hands were watching, and word would spread quickly about how the new Mr. and Mrs. Reed behaved toward each other. She forced herself to soften her tone. "Thank you." Jonas nodded, understanding flickering in his dark eyes. This performance had already begun, and it would require both of them to play their parts convincingly. Pete approached, hat in hand. "Mrs. Reed," he said, and the name hit Margaret like a physical blow. "The boys and I thought we'd give you folks some privacy today." "We'll handle the evening chores." Mrs. Reed. She was Mrs. Reed now. The name felt foreign on her tongue, like trying to speak a language she didn't understand, but she managed a grateful smile. "That's kind of you, Pete. Thank you." As the hands dispersed, leaving them alone in front of the house Thomas had built, Margaret felt the full weight of their situation settle upon her. She had a stranger for a husband, a man whose past was written in scars across his body, whose future might bring violence to her door, and now they had to figure out how to live together, how to maintain this charade without losing themselves in the process. "I should move my things from the barn," Jonas said, breaking the silence. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "People will expect to see evidence that you're living in the house." They walked together toward the barn, the morning sun warming the rain-soaked earth, sending up wisps of steam that made the whole world seem dreamlike and unreal. Jonas's few possessions were already packed in worn saddlebags and a single trunk. The sparseness of it struck Margaret. This was a man ready to run at a moment's notice, who traveled light because he never knew when he'd have to leave everything behind. "Is this all?" she asked. "Never saw the point in accumulating things I couldn't carry," Jonas replied, hefting the trunk easily. "Things just weigh you down when you need to move fast." "And do you? Need to move fast?" He paused, considering. "Not today. Today I'm a married man with a ranch to help run." The words hung between them, heavy with irony and something else, perhaps a tentative hope that this arrangement might offer them both something neither had expected. Back at the house, Margaret showed Jonas to Thomas's study. It was a small room lined with books Thomas had collected over the years, maps of the territory pinned to the walls, a desk where he'd done the ranch accounts. The daybed in the corner looked almost like an afterthought, barely large enough for a man Jonas's size. "It's not much," Margaret said apologetically. "It's more than I've had in years," Jonas replied, setting down his trunk. "And I appreciate you letting me stay in the house at all, considering what? That we're strangers forced into marriage? That you're a killer running from your past? That I'm a widow who buried her husband less than a week ago?" The words came out harsher than she intended, exhaustion and grief making her raw. Jonas turned to face her fully. Yes, considering all of that, his honest acknowledgement of their situation somehow made it more bearable. He wasn't pretending this was anything other than what it was, an arrangement born of necessity and survival. "I'll leave you to settle in," Margaret said, turning to go. "Margaret." Her name on his lips stopped her. "We need to talk about how this is going to work. The practical matters." She nodded, though everything in her wanted to flee, to saddle her horse and ride until she reached somewhere where no one knew her name or her circumstances, but that was a luxury she couldn't afford. "After dinner," she said. "We'll discuss everything then." The rest of the day passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. Margaret went through the motions of her daily routine, checking on the horses, reviewing the accounts, planning the week's work with Pete. But everything felt different now. She was aware of Jonas's presence in the house even when she couldn't see him, the way the floorboards creaked under his unfamiliar weight, the sound of his boots different from Thomas's lighter step. Late in the afternoon, she found him in the barn, checking over the horses with a practiced eye. He had a way with them, she noticed, his movements calm and confident. The animals responded to him with trust rather than fear. "You know horses," she observed. "Spent some time breaking them for the cavalry," Jonas said, running his hand along a mare's flank. "Horses are honest. They don't pretend to be anything other than what they are. Unlike people." "Unlike people," he agreed. She watched him work for a moment, noting the efficient way he moved, the careful attention he paid to each animal. Despite everything, she found herself thinking that Thomas might have liked him, might have appreciated his quiet competence and lack of pretension. "That bay gelding has been favoring his left front foot," Jonas said, not looking at her. "Might want to have the farrier take a look." "I noticed," Margaret said, slightly defensive. "He's coming tomorrow." "Good." Jonas moved to the next stall. "The fence in the south pasture needs work too. Saw it when I was riding in this morning. Few more storms and it'll come down entirely." "Are you trying to tell me how to run my ranch, Mr. Reed?" He turned to face her then, his expression unreadable. "No, ma'am. Just observing. This is your place. I'm just here to help where I can." The formality of ma'am, after the intimacy of using her given name earlier, felt like a step backward, but perhaps that was safer for both of them. Dinner that evening was a stilted affair. Margaret had cooked again, roast beef this time, with potatoes and carrots from her garden. They ate in near silence, the clink of silverware against plates, unnaturally loud. Finally, as she cleared the dishes, Margaret couldn't stand it anymore. "This is absurd," she said. "We're going to drive each other mad if we can't even have a conversation." Jonas leaned back in his chair, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. "What would you like to talk about, Mrs. Reed? The weather? The cattle prices? How strange it is to be married to someone you met properly for the first time 3 days ago." Despite herself, Margaret felt her lips twitch. "All of those sound like fascinating topics." "The weather's been wet," Jonas offered. "Cattle prices are holding steady. And yes, this is probably the strangest situation I've ever found myself in, and that's saying something." "What's the second strangest?" Jonas considered. "Woke up once in a traveling preacher's wagon, wearing his clothes, with no memory of how I got there, and a chicken sitting on my chest." Margaret blinked. "You're making that up." "God's honest truth. The preacher said I'd stumbled into his camp, bloody from a bar fight, babbling about needing to find someone named Sarah. He patched me up, but somehow in my delirium I'd put on his spare clothes. Never did figure out where mine went." "Who was Sarah?" Jonas's expression shuddered slightly. "My sister. This was right after she died. I was drinking too much, trying to forget." The moment of levity dissolved, replaced by the weight of grief they both carried. Margaret understood drinking to forget, the desperate desire to escape pain that followed you like a shadow. "I'm sorry," she said, "about your sister." "We all lose people," Jonas replied. "It's the living with it after that's hard." They moved to the parlor, where Margaret had built a small fire against the evening chill. She took the chair she always sat in, leaving Jonas to choose between Thomas's chair or the sofa. He chose the sofa, she noticed, avoiding the seat that had been his husband's. "So," Margaret began, "the practical matters." "The practical matters," Jonas echoed. "We need to establish routines, boundaries, ways to coexist without—" She searched for the words, "without making this harder than it needs to be." "Agreed. What did you have in mind?" Margaret had been thinking about this all day. "We maintain separate lives as much as possible. You work with Pete and the hands during the day. I'll continue managing the household and the ranch accounts. We'll take meals together when necessary for appearances, but otherwise we respect each other's privacy." "Sounds reasonable. What about town? Church? Social obligations?" The thought of appearing in public as Jonas's wife made Margaret's stomach turn, but she knew it was unavoidable. "We'll attend church together. It will be expected, and we'll need to go to town together occasionally, at least at first. After a few months, when the novelty wears off, we can resume more separate lives." "And if my past catches up? If those men find me?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. Then we deal with it. But I need to know what to expect. How many men? How determined are they? Jonas was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. The father, Samuel Morrison, no relation to the judge, has money and influence. He's sent 3 groups after me so far. The first gave me this. He touched his scar. The second I managed to avoid by staying ahead of them. The third caught up to me in Colorado. 2 of them won't be hunting anyone anymore. You killed them. They didn't give me a choice. Margaret absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the quiet man sitting across from her. And you think there will be more? Morrison won't stop. His son was his pride and joy, being groomed to take over his empire. The boy was cruel and entitled, but Morrison didn't see that. All he saw was his legacy bleeding out in a saloon. So we're just waiting for them to come. Maybe. Or maybe they'll lose my trail. Maybe Morrison will die or find religion or decide revenge isn't worth the cost anymore. But you don't believe that. No, Jonas admitted. I don't. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Margaret found herself studying Jonas in the firelight, the way shadows played across his scarred face, the tension he carried in his shoulders even at rest. He was a man prepared for violence at any moment, and now that potential violence had been brought into her home. Tell me about Thomas, Jonas said suddenly. How did he die? I heard it was a shooting, but... Margaret's throat tightened. She hadn't spoken about it in detail to anyone, had barely been able to process it herself. It was late, past midnight. A cowboy named Billy Daniels had been drinking all day at the saloon. He'd been bragging about how he was going to make a name for himself. Thomas tried to arrest him for disturbing the peace, get him to sleep it off in a cell. She paused, the memory threatening to overwhelm her. Jonas waited patiently, not pushing. Billy pulled his gun. He was so drunk he could barely stand, but at that range... Margaret's voice broke slightly. Thomas was fast, even surprised. He got his shot off, too. Both of them died within minutes of each other. I held Thomas while the life left him. He tried to say something at the end, but there was too much blood. I'm sorry, Jonas said quietly. That's a hard death to witness. Have you seen many men die? Too many. Does it get easier? Jonas shook his head. No, you just get better at pushing through it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Margaret's hand went instinctively to the pistol she'd taken to keeping nearby. Jonas was already on his feet, his own hand hovering near his hip where a gun would be, though he wasn't wearing one in the house. Who is it? Margaret called out. It's me, Mrs. Reed? Pete. Sorry to disturb you, but we've got a problem. Margaret opened the door to find Pete looking grim. What is it? Wolves. They got into the north pasture, took down 2 calves. The boys are out there now, but thought you should know. How many wolves? Jonas asked, appearing behind Margaret. Pete looked between them, clearly noting their proximity, the domestic picture they must present. Hard to say in the dark, at least 3 or 4 from the tracks. I'll ride out with you, Jonas said, already turning to get his coat and gun. You don't have to, Margaret began. It's my ranch too now, isn't it? Jonas said quietly. Besides, I'm a fair hand at tracking, even in the dark. Margaret wanted to protest, to maintain the boundaries they'd just discussed, but she recognized the logic in his offer. Be careful, she said instead. Something flickered in Jonas's eyes, surprise perhaps at her concern. Always am. After the men left, Margaret found herself pacing the house, unable to settle. It was strange to worry about Jonas, a man she barely knew, but she realized it wasn't really him she was worried about. It was the disruption of the fragile equilibrium they'd just begun to establish. If something happened to him on his first night as her husband, what would the town say? What would happen to the ranch? She stopped herself. When had she started thinking of potential tragedy in terms of appearances and practical consequences rather than human cost? Thomas's death had changed her, hardened something inside her that used to be soft. Unable to stand the waiting, she saddled her horse and rode out toward the north pasture. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light and black shadow. She could hear the men before she saw them, their voices carrying across the prairie. She found them gathered around the carcasses of 2 calves, torn apart with the brutal efficiency of predators. Jonas was crouched beside the remains, studying the tracks in the muddy ground. "Pack of 5, maybe 6, he was saying to Pete. "Few hours old. They went northeast toward the canyon." "Mrs. Reed," Pete said, noticing her approach, "you shouldn't be out here." "They're my cattle," Margaret replied, dismounting. "I have every right to be here." Jonas looked up at her, and she thought she saw approval in his expression. "Pack this size will be back. They found easy prey." "We'll post guards," Pete suggested. "Rotate shifts through the night." "That'll work short term," Jonas agreed, standing. "But we need to hunt them down, or we'll be losing cattle all season." "You know how to hunt wolves?" Margaret asked. "Learned from an old trapper in Montana. It's not pretty work, but sometimes necessary work isn't." They spent the next hour organizing the ranch hands into watch shifts and planning for a hunt at first light. Margaret noticed how naturally Jonas took charge of the situation, his quiet authority evident in the way the men responded to him. Even Pete, who'd been with the ranch since the beginning, deferred to Jonas's expertise. As they rode back to the house, just the 2 of them now, Margaret found herself reassessing her new husband. She'd seen him as a burden, a dangerous complication forced upon her by circumstance. But tonight, she'd glimpsed something else, a competent partner, someone who could shoulder responsibility without trying to dominate. "Thank you," she said as they unsaddled their horses, "for helping with the wolves." "It's what Thomas would have done," Jonas replied. The mention of Thomas should have hurt, but somehow it didn't. There was respect in the way Jonas said his name, an acknowledgement that Thomas's ghost would always be present in their arrangement. Inside the house, they found themselves standing awkwardly in the hallway between their respective rooms. It was late, past midnight, and exhaustion weighed on both of them. "First day as husband and wife," Jonas said with dry humor. "Not quite what the poets write about." "No roses or sonnets," Margaret agreed. "Just wolves and death and practical arrangements." "Sounds about right for Ironwood Crossing." She surprised herself by almost smiling. "Good night, Jonas." "Good night, Margaret." She closed her bedroom door and leaned against it, listening to his footsteps move toward the study. Her wedding night, such as it was. No tender embraces, no whispered promises of love, just 2 damaged people trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to break them. The next morning came too soon. Margaret woke to the sound of activity in the yard and realized Jonas and the hands had already left for the wolf hunt. She dressed quickly and went to the kitchen, finding coffee already made and still warm on the stove. Jonas must have made it before leaving. It was a small gesture, but it struck her as unexpectedly thoughtful. She spent the morning working on the account books, trying to focus on numbers and contracts rather than worrying about the hunt. But her attention kept drifting to the window, watching for riders returning. It was nearly noon when she saw them coming, a line of horsemen moving slowly across the prairie. She counted quickly. All present, no one injured. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by annoyance at herself for caring. Jonas dismounted in the yard, his clothes dusty and blood-stained. He carried a bundle of pelts, 5 wolfskins, gray and magnificent, even in death. "Got them all," Pete announced to the gathered ranch hands. Jonas tracked them to their den in the canyon. Clean shots, everyone. The men were looking at Jonas with new respect, she noticed. He'd proven himself in a way that mattered out here, shown he could protect the ranch's interests with skill and efficiency. "The pelts are yours," Jonas said, offering them to Margaret. "Should fetch a good price in town." "You hunted them," Margaret said. "They're yours to sell." "What's mine is yours, remember?" Jonas said quietly, and there was something in his tone that made her breath catch. "That's what marriage means." Before she could respond, one of the younger ranch hands called out, "Riders coming!" "Looks like Jake Murphy and his brothers." Margaret's jaw tightened. She'd wondered how long it would take for Jake to come sniffing around, testing the boundaries of her new marriage. The Murphy brothers rode into the yard like they owned it, Jake in the lead with his perpetual sneer firmly in place. "Mrs. Reed," he said, tipping his hat mockingly. "Heard you went through with it. Married the gunslinger." "Mr. Murphy?" Margaret replied coolly. "To what do we owe this visit?" "Just being neighborly. Wanted to welcome your new husband to the community." Jake's eyes found Jonas, who had stepped up to stand beside Margaret. "Reed, isn't it?" Heard some interesting stories about you. Jonas said nothing, just watched Jake with those dark, steady eyes. Cat got your tongue? Jake pressed. Or are you one of those strong, silent types? Must be quite a change for you, Margaret, from Thomas's easy conversation to this. Thomas is dead, Margaret said flatly, and you'll address me as Mrs. Reed. Sure. Jake dismounted uninvited, his brothers following suit. Just seems a shame, a woman like you settling for damaged goods. He gestured at Jonas's scar. Though I suppose beggars can't be choosers. Margaret felt Jonas tense beside her, but his voice was calm when he spoke. You've welcomed us. Now you can leave. Jake stepped closer, and Margaret could smell the whiskey on him despite the early hour. I'm not sure you understand how things work around here, Reed. We've been in Ironwood Crossing a long time. We've got influence, connections. You're just some drifter who got lucky. Lucky, Jonas repeated, and there was something dangerous in his quiet tone. Is that what you call it? What else would you call it? Landing a ranch and a woman like Margaret just by being in the right place at the right time? Jonas moved then, so fast Margaret barely saw it. One moment he was standing beside her, the next he had Jake pressed against the side of the barn, forearm across his throat. Let me explain something, Jonas said, his voice still terribly calm. I've been polite because Margaret deserves better than violence on her property. But if you disrespect her again, if you come here again without invitation, if you so much as look at her wrong in town, I'll forget my manners. And trust me, Murphy, you don't want that. Jake's brothers had started forward, but stopped when Pete and the ranch hands stepped up, hands on their guns. The moment stretched taut, violence hovering in the air like heat shimmer. You're making a mistake, Jake gasped out. You don't know who you're threatening. I know exactly who I'm threatening, Jonas replied. A small man who thinks he's big because he's got money and brothers. I've faced down men who'd eat you for breakfast, Murphy. You don't scare me. He released Jake, who stumbled back, hand going to his throat. This isn't over, Reed. It is unless you want it to get worse, Jonas said. Now get off our land. The Murphy brothers mounted up, Jake's face red with humiliation and rage. As they rode away, Jake turned back. You've made an enemy today, Reed. Both of you. After they were gone, the ranch hands dispersed, talking excitedly among themselves about what they'd witnessed. Pete clapped Jonas on the shoulder before heading to the barn, leaving Margaret and Jonas alone in the yard. You didn't have to do that, Margaret said. Yes, I did. Jonas turned to her. They needed to know there are boundaries. That being your husband means something, even if it's not what they think. And what does it mean? Jonas considered the question. It means you're under my protection, for whatever that's worth. It means anyone who wants to hurt you or take what's yours has to go through me first. I can protect myself. I know you can. But now you don't have to do it alone. The simple statement hit Margaret unexpectedly hard. She'd been alone since Thomas died, truly alone in a way she hadn't been since coming to Ironwood Crossing. The idea that someone else would stand with her, even out of obligation rather than love, was both comforting and terrifying. Thank you, she managed. Jonas nodded and headed toward the barn, leaving Margaret standing in the yard, trying to understand the shift that had just occurred. In confronting Jake, Jonas had publicly claimed his role as her husband, not just in law but in practice. The town would hear about this by nightfall. Everyone would know that Jonas Reed was not merely a placeholder husband, but a force to be reckoned with. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, there was a different quality to the silence between them. Not comfortable exactly, but less strained. They'd faced a threat together, stood as a unit against outside pressure. It was a small step toward something, not friendship perhaps, but maybe partnership. The wolf pelts will bring good money, Jonas said, cutting into the silence. Enough to hire extra hands for the fall drive. Margaret looked up from her plate. You're thinking about the ranch's future? Aren't you? Yes, but I didn't expect you to. Jonas set down his fork. Margaret, I know this isn't what either of us wanted. But I'm here now, and I meant what I said to the judge. I'm tired of running. This ranch, this life, it's more than I expected to have. I'd like to help build something instead of just destroying. And when your past comes calling, Then I'll deal with it. But until then, I'd like to pretend I'm just a rancher with work to do and a place to belong. The vulnerability in his admission caught Margaret off guard. She'd been so focused on her own loss, her own anger at the situation, that she hadn't considered what this meant for Jonas. He was a man without a home, without family, hunted and alone. This arranged marriage, forced though it was, offered him something he'd clearly been lacking: stability, purpose, a reason to stop running. "All right," she said, "we'll build something. Together." Jonas looked at her with surprise that shifted into something warmer. Together. That night, a thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains, rattling the windows and sending sheets of rain against the roof. Margaret lay in bed listening to the storm, unable to sleep. The sound of footsteps in the hall made her tense until she recognized Jonas's tread, pacing in the study. He couldn't sleep either, it seemed. On impulse, she rose and pulled on her robe, padding barefoot to the study door. She knocked softly. "Come in," Jonas called. She found him standing by the window, watching the lightning illuminate the prairie in brief, brilliant flashes. He'd removed his boots and vest, standing in shirt sleeves and suspenders, looking more relaxed than she'd yet seen him. "Can't sleep either?" he asked without turning around. "Storms always keep me awake," Margaret admitted, moving to stand beside him at the window. "Thomas used to say I was like a horse, sensing trouble in the weather." "Maybe you do. Storms bring change, and change isn't always welcome." They stood together watching nature's violence play out across the landscape. Lightning struck somewhere close, the thunder following immediately, rattling the glass. "Does it bother you?" Margaret asked. "The thunder?" "Some men who've been in battles." "Sometimes," Jonas admitted. "There are nights when it takes me back to the war, to cannon fire and men screaming, but tonight," he paused, "tonight it just feels clean, like the world is washing itself new." "Do you ever wish you could do that? Wash yourself clean of the past?" Jonas turned to look at her then, his face half in shadow, half illuminated by the next flash of lightning. "Every day. But the past has a way of clinging, no matter how hard you try to scrub it away." Without thinking, Margaret reached out and touched the scar on his face, her fingers ghosting over the raised tissue. Jonas went very still, but didn't pull away. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Not anymore. Just pulls sometimes when the weather changes." "You were handsome once," she said, then immediately flushed at the inappropriate observation. "I mean, I know what you mean," Jonas said quietly. "The scar changed things. People see it before they see me now. Makes them nervous, afraid." "I'm not afraid of you." "No?" His voice dropped lower. "Maybe you should be. I'm everything they say. A killer, a man with blood on his hands." "We all have blood on our hands, one way or another," Margaret said, thinking of Billy Daniels dying in the street, of the choices that had led them all to this moment. "The question is what we do with the life that's left." Jonas caught her hand, still raised near his face, and held it gently. His hands were calloused from work, scarred from violence, but his touch was careful, almost reverent. "Margaret," he said, and her name on his lips was like a question and an answer all at once. The moment stretched between them, charged like the air before lightning strikes. Then another crack of thunder shook the house, breaking the spell. Margaret pulled her hand back, stepping away. "I should try to sleep," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Yes," Jonas agreed, his voice rough. "You should." She fled back to her room, her heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with the storm. Behind her closed door, she pressed her palms to her burning cheeks. What was she doing? Thomas had been dead barely a week, and here she was, touching another man's face in the dark, feeling what? Attraction? Curiosity? Loneliness so acute that any connection felt like salvation? She crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, trying not to think about Jonas standing alone in the study, about the way his hand had felt holding hers. This was dangerous territory. They'd established boundaries, agreed to a platonic arrangement. She couldn't afford to complicate things with feelings that had nowhere to go. But as the storm raged outside, Margaret couldn't forget the look in Jonas's eyes when she'd touched his scar. The mixture of pain and surprise and something else. a hunger that matched her own for human connection, for something real in the midst of all this forced pretense. The next morning brought awkwardness. They moved around each other carefully at breakfast, excessively polite, avoiding eye contact. The intimacy of the night before hung between them like a physical presence, making every ordinary interaction feel charged with meaning. "I'll be working on the south fence today," Jonas said, not looking up from his coffee. "I'm going to town for supplies," Margaret replied to her eggs. "Would you like me to come with you?" "For appearances?" "No, I need to do this alone. People need to see that I'm still capable of handling my own affairs." Jonas nodded. "Be careful. After yesterday with Murphy. I can handle Jake Murphy." "I know you can. But men like him don't like being humiliated. He might try something." Margaret wanted to argue, to insist she didn't need his concern, but the worry in his voice was genuine. "I'll take Pete with me," she conceded. The ride to town was a relief, a chance to clear her head and escape the confusing tension of the house. But any hope of a simple supply run evaporated the moment she entered the general store. Conversation stopped, every eye turning to her. "Mrs. Reed," Mrs. Patterson said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "How are you adjusting to married life?" "Well enough," Margaret replied curtly, moving toward the counter. "Your new husband certainly made an impression yesterday," Mrs. Clement added. "Jake Murphy's telling everyone that Jonas attacked him unprovoked." "Is that what he's saying?" Margaret turned to face the gossips. "How interesting. I suppose he left out the part where he came to my property uninvited, insulted both my late husband and my current one, and implied that I was somehow his for the taking." The women had the grace to look slightly ashamed, but Mrs. Patterson rallied. "Still, such violence. It must be frightening living with a man capable of such things." "What frightens me," Margaret said evenly, "is living in a town where a widow can't mourn in peace without being treated like property to be claimed. What frightens me is the assumption that I need protection from the man I married, while ignoring the very real threats from men who think they're entitled to what's mine." She turned to Mr. Patterson behind the counter. "I need flour, coffee, sugar, and ammunition. The usual amounts." "Ammunition?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened. "Whatever for?" "Wolves," Margaret said simply. "And other predators." As her supplies were being gathered, she became aware of a commotion outside. Through the window, she could see Jonas riding into town, moving fast. Her heart lurched. Something was wrong. He dismounted in front of the store just as she emerged. His shirt was torn, blood seeping through at the shoulder. "What happened?" she demanded, already reaching for him. "Riders at the ranch," he said tersely. "Not Murphy. Strangers. They were asking questions about me." Margaret's blood ran cold. His past had found him already. "How many?" "3. I sent them on their way, but they'll be back." He looked around the growing crowd of townspeople. "We should go." They loaded the supplies quickly, ignoring the whispers and stares. As they rode out of town, Pete flanking them with his rifle ready, Margaret could feel the weight of eyes on their backs. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said once they were clear of town. They rode up asking for Jonas Reed. "Had descriptions, knew about the scar. I told them they had the wrong place, but they didn't believe me. Things got physical." "You fought 3 men?" "I convinced them to leave," Jonas said grimly, "but they'll be back with more men." "Morrison must have gotten word of the marriage, figured out where I am." Margaret's mind raced. "How long do we have?" "A day, maybe 2. They'll want to scout the ranch, figure out the best approach. Then we prepare." Jonas looked at her sharply. "Margaret, this isn't your fight. You should leave, go to town, stay with—" "This is my ranch," Margaret interrupted. "My home." "I'm not running. These men are killers. They won't care that you're a woman, that you're innocent in this." "Nobody's innocent," Margaret said, "and I'm not as helpless as you seem to think." Back at the ranch, they found the hands in an uproar. Word of the strangers had spread, and everyone was on edge. Pete had already posted guards and brought the horses in from the far pastures. "We should send for the sheriff," one of the younger hands suggested. "There is no sheriff," Margaret reminded him. "Not since Thomas died." and the federal marshal is 3 days away. Then we handle this ourselves, Jonas said. He looked at the assembled men. Any of you who want to leave, now's the time. This isn't your fight, and I won't hold it against you. To Margaret's surprise and gratitude, none of the hands moved. Pete spat tobacco juice. We ride for the brand, he said simply. Doesn't matter who owns it. Jonas nodded, respect clear in his eyes. Then we need to prepare. Pete, set up rotating watches. Tom, Jack, bring all the ammunition from the storeroom. We'll distribute it among defensible positions. Margaret watched Jonas transform into the man he'd been trying to leave behind. A tactical thinker, a fighter, someone who understood violence intimately. It should have frightened her, but instead she found it reassuring. If violence was coming, better to have someone who knew how to meet it. That night they sat in the parlor cleaning and checking weapons. The domestic scene turned martial, the coffee table covered in guns and ammunition instead of books and teacups. You're sure you won't leave? Jonas asked again. Would you? If it was your home, your land, would you run? That's different. Because you're a man? Because I'm the one they're after. Your life shouldn't be at risk because of a forced marriage to me. Margaret looked up from the rifle she was cleaning. My life was at risk the moment Thomas died. From the Murphy brothers, from any man who thought a widow with land was easy prey. At least with you, I know where the danger's coming from. Jonas studied her for a long moment. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone softer, weaker, someone who needed protection. I am soft, Margaret said quietly. Or I was. Thomas kept that part of me safe, but softness doesn't survive out here without strength to guard it. No, Jonas agreed. It doesn't. They worked in companionable silence after that, preparing for whatever was coming. As the night wore on, Margaret found herself stealing glances at Jonas, noting the efficient way he handled the weapons, the steady calm he projected despite the danger approaching. Are you afraid? She asked. Always, he replied without hesitation. Fear keeps you alive. It's when you stop being afraid that you make mistakes. You don't seem afraid. I've learned to live with it, like a chronic pain. It's always there, but you can't let it control you. Margaret understood that. She'd been living with the chronic pain of grief, of loss, of fear for her future. Perhaps that's what made them compatible. Not love or attraction, but a shared understanding of how to function despite the hurt. A shout from outside brought them both to their feet. One of the guards was calling an alarm. Riders approaching! Looks like 6, maybe 7. Jonas grabbed his gun belt, strapping it on with practiced ease. Stay inside. No matter what happens, stay inside. Like hell, Margaret said, picking up her rifle. He turned to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. Instead, he nodded. Stay behind cover at least. They moved onto the porch, where Pete and several hands had already taken position. The riders were visible now in the moonlight, moving slowly toward the house. They stopped just outside rifle range, and one man rode forward alone. Jonas Reed, he called out. Samuel Morrison sends his regards. Tell Morrison to go to hell, Jonas called back. The rider laughed. He said you'd say that. He also said to tell you he's got a proposition. Not interested. You haven't heard it yet. Morrison's willing to call off the hunt. Let you live in peace. All you have to do is come with us, face him like a man. One final confrontation, and it's over. And if I win? Then you win. The debt's paid. Margaret knew it was a lie. Men like Morrison didn't offer fair fights to the people who'd killed their sons. This was a trap, pure and simple. I've got a counter proposition, Jonas called. You and your men turn around and ride away. Tell Morrison I'm done running, but I'm also done fighting his war. His son was a fool who got himself killed. That's not on me. The rider's voice turned cold. Then we do this the hard way. You've got a nice place here, Reed. Pretty wife, too. Be a shame if something happened to them because of your pride. The threat against Margaret changed everything. Jonas stepped out from cover, and even from behind, Margaret could see the shift in his posture, the deadly intent radiating from him. You just made a mistake, Jonas said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. You brought her into this. Now I'm going to have to kill you all. The rider laughed, but it sounded forced. Big talk for an outnumbered man. I'm not outnumbered. I'm surrounded. There's a difference. The tension stretched taut, violence hovering on the edge of erupting. Then Margaret stepped out beside Jonas, her rifle raised and aimed. You should know, she called out, that this ranch has stood against Comanche raids, cattle thieves, and worse. We've buried men who thought they could take what's ours. Your employer's son learned that lesson too late. Don't make the same mistake. The sight of her armed and unafraid seemed to unsettle the riders. The spokesman wheeled his horse around and rode back to confer with the others. They'll attack at dawn, Jonas said quietly. They need daylight for what they're planning. Then we have the night to prepare. As the riders withdrew to make camp just beyond the property line, the ranch became a fortress. Jonas worked with military efficiency, positioning men, creating crossfire zones, identifying weak points. Margaret found herself following his lead without question, recognizing expertise when she saw it. You've done this before, she observed. Defended a position against superior numbers. During the war. And after, a few times. He looked at her in the lamplight. You should still leave. Take the best horse, ride for town. Even if they follow, you'd have a head start. We've covered this, Jonas. I'm staying. He surprised her by smiling, a real smile that transformed his scarred face. Thomas was right about you. You're formidable. He said that? Among other things, he loved you very much. The unexpected kindness of it. The mention of Thomas's love in the midst of preparing for battle nearly undid her. Tears threatened, but she forced them back. Save the sentiment for after, she said. We have work to do. As dawn approached, they took their positions. Margaret found herself at an upstairs window with a clear view of the approaches. Jonas was below, coordinating the defense. The waiting was agony, each minute stretching like an hour. The attack, when it came, was sudden and fierce. The first shots cracked through the morning air like thunder, shattering the tense quiet that had held the ranch in its grip. Margaret's rifle kicked against her shoulder as she fired at the riders charging toward the house, her hand steady despite the chaos erupting below. She could hear Jonas shouting orders, his voice cutting through the gunfire with commanding authority. The attackers had split into two groups, one making for the barn while the other pressed toward the house. Margaret tracked a rider attempting to flank their position, leading him carefully before squeezing the trigger. He tumbled from his saddle, his horse veering away in panic. She felt nothing in that moment, no triumph, no horror, just the cold necessity of survival. They're trying to burn us out, Pete's voice rang from below. Through the window, Margaret could see smoke beginning to rise from the barn. If they lost the barn, they'd lose their tactical advantage and likely their lives. Without thinking, she abandoned her position and ran downstairs, nearly colliding with Jonas in the hallway. His shirt was torn, blood streaking his arm from a graze. "The barn," she gasped. "I know. Stay here." But she was already pushing past him, heading for the back door. She heard him curse behind her but didn't stop. The barn held more than tactical value. It held their winter feed, their equipment, their future. She wouldn't let it burn. The smoke was thicker than she'd expected, already filling the structure. Two of Morrison's men were inside, spreading kerosene. They turned at her entrance, surprise flickering across their faces at seeing a woman charging toward them with a rifle raised. That moment of hesitation cost them. Margaret shot the first man center mass, the force of it driving him back into the hay bales. The second man dove for cover, firing wildly. Splinters exploded from the beam beside her head as she dropped and rolled, coming up behind a feed bin. "Just a woman," the man called out mockingly. "Come on out, sweetheart. I promise to make it quick." Margaret said nothing, listening for his movement. Thomas had taught her that silence was often more unnerving than threats. She heard boots scraping against the floor, moving to flank her position. She waited, patient as a hunter, until she saw his shadow fall across the gap between stalls. She fired through the thin wood, heard him cry out and fall. When she emerged, he was crawling toward his dropped pistol, leaving a trail of blood. She kicked the weapon away and left him there, more concerned with stopping the fire than finishing him off. Jonas appeared in the doorway as she was beating at the flames with a horse blanket. Without a word, he joined her, and together they managed to smother the fire before it could spread to the hay stores. The man she'd wounded had dragged himself outside, where Pete's men had captured him. That was reckless, Jonas said, his breathing hard. That was necessary, Margaret countered. He looked at her for a long moment, taking in her smoke-blackened face, her torn dress, the rifle still clutched in her hands. You're full of surprises, Margaret Reed. Before she could respond, fresh gunfire erupted from the house. They ran back to find the remaining attackers making a desperate final assault. The ranch hands were holding, but barely. Jonas waded into the fight with a terrible efficiency, his movements economical and deadly. Margaret had seen Thomas in gunfights, had seen him face down dangerous men, but this was different. Jonas fought like someone who'd learned violence as a language, who spoke it fluently and without hesitation. Within minutes, it was over. 3 attackers dead, 2 wounded and captured, 1 fled. The ranch had held, though at a cost. 1 hand dead, 3 wounded, including Jonas, whose arm wound was worse than he'd let on. As Margaret bandaged his arm in the kitchen, her hands gentle despite their trembling, Jonas watched her with an unreadable expression. You saved the barn, he said. We saved the barn, she corrected. You shot 2 men. They were trying to burn my home. She tied off the bandage, perhaps tighter than necessary. I told you I wasn't helpless. No, he agreed quietly. You're not. The wounded attacker they'd captured was willing to talk in exchange for medical treatment. Morrison had indeed sent them, promising a substantial bounty for Jonas, dead or alive. But more concerning was his claim that this was just the first wave. Morrison himself was coming with a larger force, maybe a week behind. We need help, Pete said bluntly as they gathered to discuss their options. 7 men against Morrison's money and connections. We can't hold forever. The federal marshal, one of the hands began, is still 3 days away, and that's if he's even at his office, Jonas interrupted. By the time he gets here, it'll be over one way or another. Then we make it not worth Morrison's while, Margaret said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. This is about revenge, yes? About his son? What if we give him something else he wants more? There's nothing he wants more, Jonas said. Trust me, I know the type. His son was his legacy, his immortality. That's not something you can negotiate with. Everything's negotiable if you know the right leverage. Margaret stood, pacing as she thought out loud. Morrison's a businessman, you said. Owns half of Kansas. Men like that, they understand profit and loss. Right now, killing you is all profit for him. Satisfaction, reputation, closure. We need to make it cost him something. What are you thinking? Jonas asked warily. The railroad's coming through next year. They'll need beef contracts, water rights, land for depots. This ranch is perfectly positioned for all of that. Morrison's a businessman. He has to be interested in those opportunities. Pete shook his head. You want to make a business deal with the man trying to kill your husband? I want to survive, Margaret said firmly, and if that means swallowing my pride and treating with the devil, then so be it. Jonas stood abruptly. No, I won't have you negotiating for my life like I'm cattle to be traded. But you are, Margaret said, meeting his eyes steadily. We both are. That's what this whole situation has been from the start. The town trading me to you, you accepting the trade for protection. At least this time, we'd be the ones setting the terms. The room fell silent at her blunt assessment. Jonas's jaw tightened, but he couldn't argue with her logic. Even if Morrison would negotiate, he said finally, what makes you think he'd honor any agreement? Because I'll make it more profitable for him to let you live than to kill you. Margaret turned to Pete. Send writers to Fort Morgan, to Denver, to every newspaper in the territory. Let them know that Samuel Morrison is coming here with a private army to murder a man over a 3-year-old bar fight. Make sure they know he's threatening a widow's ranch, that he's already sent men who attacked us. Public pressure? Jonas sounded skeptical. Public shame, Margaret corrected. Men like Morrison care about their reputations, their legacies. If we make this fight public, make him look like a vindictive old man attacking a widow and her new husband, it becomes harder for him to act with impunity. And if he doesn't care, if he comes anyway, then we fight. But at least we'll have tried something other than waiting to die. Jonas studied her for a long moment. You're not the woman I thought I was marrying. Good, Margaret said. Because the woman you thought you were marrying would have gotten us both killed. They spent the next 2 days in frantic preparation. Letters were sent, telegrams dispatched. Margaret even wrote to Thomas's sister in Boston, asking her to use her connections in Eastern newspapers to publicize their plight. It was manipulation, using Thomas's memory this way, but Margaret was past caring about propriety. Jonas, meanwhile, worked on fortifying their defenses, but there was a different quality to his preparations now. He watched Margaret constantly, something shifting in his expression whenever she took charge of a situation or made a particularly strategic decision. On the third night, as they sat exhausted in the parlor, he finally voiced what had been building between them. "You should have been running this ranch alone from the start," he said. "You never needed a husband for protection. You're more capable than most men I've known." "Capability doesn't matter to the law," Margaret replied, staring into the fire. "Only anatomy." "It's not right." She looked at him, surprised by the vehemence in his voice. "Since when has right had anything to do with how the world works?" "It should." Thomas knew it. That's why he talked about you the way he did. He saw you clear, saw what you could be if the world would let you. Thomas saw what he wanted to see. A wife he could protect and provide for. He loved me, but he never really understood that I wanted to be his partner, not his dependent. "And now?" Jonas asked carefully. "What do you want now?" Margaret considered the question. "I want to survive. I want to keep my ranch. I want to stop feeling like I'm drowning every moment of every day. That's all." She met his eyes. "What else is there?" "Connection, purpose, something to wake up for besides duty. Is that what you're looking for?" "I thought I was just looking for a place to stop running. But now," he paused, seeming to wrestle with the words, "now I find myself looking forward to morning coffee because you'll be across the table. I find myself wanting to tell you things about my day, to hear your thoughts on the ranch's future. It's been 5 days since we were forced into this arrangement, and already I can't imagine this place without you in it." The admission hung between them, raw and unexpected. Margaret's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Jonas, we can't. This situation is complicated enough without adding feelings to it. Feelings are already here whether we acknowledge them or not." He leaned forward, intense. "I'm not saying I love you. I barely know you. But there's something here, Margaret. Something that could grow if we let it. My husband is barely cold in the ground." "Your husband is dead," Jonas said bluntly. "And you're alive. Thomas wouldn't want you to stop living because he's gone. Don't presume to know what Thomas would want. Then tell me what you want. Not what's proper, not what's expected. What do you want?" Margaret stood abruptly, agitated. "I want my life back. I want Thomas alive and everything the way it was. But since I can't have that, I want—" She stopped, unable or unwilling to voice the truth. Jonas rose too, moving closer but not touching her. "What, Margaret? What do you want?" "I want to stop feeling so alone," she whispered, the admission torn from her. "I want to feel something besides grief and anger. I want." She looked up at him, this scarred stranger who'd become her husband, who'd fought for her ranch, who looked at her with eyes that held understanding rather than pity. Without conscious thought, she reached up and touched his face again, her fingers tracing the scar. This time, when he caught her hand, he brought it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent heat through her entire body. "Margaret," he said, her name a question. Her answer was to rise on her toes and press her lips to his. The kiss was nothing like the chaste pecks she'd shared with Thomas in their courtship, or even the comfortable affection of their marriage. This was fire and desperation, two damaged people finding solace in each other. Jonas's arms came around her, pulling her against him, and Margaret melted into his strength, letting herself feel something other than pain for the first time since Thomas's death. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, reality crashed back in. "I'm sorry," Margaret gasped, stepping back. "I shouldn't have—" "Don't," Jonas interrupted. "Don't apologize for being human, for wanting connection. We're not betraying anyone, Margaret. We're just trying to survive." Before she could respond, a shout from outside interrupted them. "Riders coming!" Lots of them. They rushed to the porch to find Pete and the guards already in position. In the distance, lit by torches, a procession of riders approached, at least 20 men, moving with military precision. "Morrison," Jonas said grimly, "he's early." Margaret's mind raced. They weren't ready. The public pressure campaign had barely begun. They were outnumbered 3-1 at least. But as the riders came closer, she noticed something odd. "They're carrying a white flag," Pete said, sounding confused. Indeed, the lead rider held a flag of truce. As they came into clearer view, Margaret could see an older man at the center of the group, well-dressed and sitting his horse with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "That's Morrison," Jonas confirmed, his hand resting on his gun. The party stopped just outside rifle range, and Morrison himself rode forward with 2 guards, the white flag prominent. "Jonas Reed," Morrison called out, his voice carrying clearly. "I've come to talk." "Talk?" Jonas called back. "Your men already did your talking. We sent them back in boxes." "Yes, I heard." "Mrs. Reed's letter reached me 2 days ago, along with several newspaper reporters eager for a story about the railroad baron turned vigilante." Morrison's voice carried dry amusement. "Your wife is quite clever, Reed. Quite clever, Reed. She's made it very difficult for me to simply kill you without consequences." Margaret stepped forward before Jonas could respond. "Then perhaps we can discuss this like civilized people, Mr. Morrison." "Would you care to come inside? I have coffee, and we can discuss how to resolve this situation without further bloodshed." Morrison studied her in the torchlight. "You must be the widow." "Thomas Hale's wife." "Jonas Reed's wife now," Margaret corrected firmly.
"Yes, so I've heard. A forced marriage to keep your ranch. You have my sympathies, Mrs. Reed. To be bound to your husband's killer must be difficult. The only difficulty I've faced has been from men who think they have the right to control my life," Margaret replied evenly. "Your son was one of them, from what I understand. Perhaps if he'd been raised to respect others rather than take what he wanted, he'd still be alive." The guards behind Morrison tensed, hands moving toward weapons, but Morrison raised a hand to stop them. To Margaret's surprise, he laughed. "You have spine, Mrs. Reed. I can see why my investigators spoke of you with respect." He dismounted, a gesture of surprising trust. "Very well, let's discuss terms, but Reed comes too." This concerns him most of all. They gathered in the parlor in surreal scene, Margaret serving coffee to the man who'd come to kill her husband, while armed men stood guard outside.
Morrison was older than she'd expected, perhaps 60, with silver hair and shrewd eyes that missed nothing. "Your letter was illuminating, Mrs. Reed," Morrison began. "You painted quite a picture. The poor widow forced to marry a gunslinger, now defending her home against a vengeful old man. The newspapers would indeed enjoy that story. It's not a story." "It's the truth," Margaret said. "Truth is subjective. My truth is that this man," he gestured at Jonas, "killed my only son. Shot him down in cold blood over a card game." "Your son drew first," Jonas said quietly. "There were witnesses." "Witnesses can be bought or intimidated, but that's beside the point now." Morrison set down his coffee cup. "Your wife has made it clear that pursuing my vengeance will cost me more than I'm willing to pay. The railroad contracts she mentioned, I've already been in negotiations for those. Having my name dragged through the mud would jeopardize those deals." "So you're giving up?" Jonas sounded skeptical. "I'm considering alternatives." Morrison looked between them. "You took my son from me, Reed. My legacy, my future. I wanted to take everything from you in return. But you have nothing, no family, no home, no life except what this woman has given you. Killing you would be a mercy." "Then what do you want?" Margaret asked. Morrison's smile was cold. "I want him to suffer, to live every day knowing he owes his life to my mercy, to wake up every morning remembering that he's alive because I chose to let him live." He stood. "So here are my terms. Reed lives, but he works for me. 1 year of service. He comes to Kansas, works my ranch, follows my orders. After that, the debt is paid." "No," Margaret said immediately. "Absolutely not." "It's not your decision, Mrs. Reed. He's my husband." "That makes it my decision, too." Morrison looked amused. Your husband in name only, from what I understand. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. Margaret stood, moving to stand beside Jonas. You're wrong. Whatever started as business has become something more. Jonas is under my protection, Mr. Morrison. You want him? You go through me. Margaret, Jonas said warningly. She ignored him, focusing on Morrison. You want the railroad contracts? I can help with that. This ranch's position, our water rights, our connections, they're valuable. Partner with us instead of pursuing this vendetta, and we both profit. You're suggesting a business partnership with your husband's would-be killer? I'm suggesting we all act like adults instead of characters in some dime novel. Your son is dead. Nothing will bring him back. Jonas has suffered for it, hunted for 3 years, scarred, alone. The debt has been paid in its own way. Now we can either continue this cycle of violence, or we can find a way forward that benefits everyone. Morrison studied her for a long moment. You're not what I expected. I rarely am. And if I refuse, if I insist on my terms, Margaret's voice turned steel, then you'll have the fight you came for. But win or lose, your name will be ruined. Every newspaper from here to Boston will carry the story of Samuel Morrison, the railroad baron who brought a private army to terrorize a widow. Your legacy won't be your business empire. It'll be as a vindictive old man who couldn't let go of his hate. The room fell silent except for the crackling fire. Jonas hadn't moved or spoken, letting Margaret take the lead, trusting her to navigate this dangerous negotiation. Finally, Morrison laughed, a genuine sound this time. You remind me of my late wife. She had the same way of cutting through to the heart of things. He looked at Jonas. You're a lucky man, Reed. Luckier than you deserve. I know, Jonas said simply. Morrison moved to the window, looking out at his men. The railroad contracts are worth more than vengeance. And perhaps it's time to let the dead rest. He turned back to them. Very well, Mrs. Reed. We'll draw up a partnership agreement. Your ranch provides beef and water. My connections ensure the contracts. As for you, Reed, you live. But if you ever set foot in Kansas again, that amnesty ends. Agreed, Jonas said immediately. Morrison moved toward the door, then paused. My son was not a good man, Mrs. Reed. I knew that, but he was my son. Can you understand that? I understand loving someone despite their flaws, Margaret said, thinking of Thomas, of Jonas, of herself. I understand that grief makes us do terrible things. Morrison nodded and left without another word. They watched from the porch as his party rode away, taking with them the immediate threat of violence. When they were gone, Jonas turned to Margaret. You just negotiated with one of the most dangerous men in 3 territories and won. I didn't win. We survived. There's a difference. You saved my life. You saved mine first. When the Murphy brothers came, when Morrison's first men attacked, we're even. Jonas shook his head. We'll never be even. What you just did... He stopped, seeming to run out of words. Margaret suddenly felt exhausted, the weight of the past days crashing down on her. I need to rest. But as she turned to go inside, Jonas caught her hand. Margaret, about earlier, the kiss, was a mistake, she finished. We were emotional, facing death. It didn't mean anything. Didn't it? His thumb stroked across her knuckles. Because it meant something to me. She pulled her hand away. Jonas, we can't. It's too soon, too complicated. We're barely managing this arrangement as it is. You're right, he said, though his eyes said differently. We should keep things as they are. But that night, as Margaret lay in her bed, she couldn't forget the feel of his lips on hers, the safety she'd felt in his arms. She'd been attracted to Thomas, had loved him deeply, but it had been a comfortable love, built on shared dreams and gentle affection. What she felt stirring for Jonas was different, dangerous, consuming, like prairie fire that could either warm you or destroy everything in its path. Over the next week, they settled into an uneasy routine. The partnership with Morrison was formalized, papers drawn up by lawyers from Denver. The ranch hands, having proven their loyalty in battle, were given raises and bonuses. The 3 men wounded in the fight recovered, adding to the ranch's reputation as a place where loyalty was rewarded and threats were met head-on. Jonas and Margaret maintained careful distance, polite but formal, each hyper-aware of the other's presence. They took meals together, discussed ranch business, presented a united front to the world. But underneath, tension simmered. It came to a head one evening when Margaret was struggling with a particularly stubborn horse, a stallion they'd recently acquired who refused to accept a saddle. She'd been working with him for hours, patient but firm, when Jonas appeared at the corral fence. "He's testing you," he observed. "I'm aware," Margaret said through gritted teeth as the stallion bucked again, nearly catching her with a hoof. "Let me—" "No." She turned on him, exhausted and frustrated. "I don't need you to rescue me, Jonas. Not from horses, not from men, not from anything. I wasn't trying to rescue you. I was trying to help. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because ever since Morrison left, you've been watching me like I'm made of glass, like I might break at any moment. That's not—" Jonas stopped, ran a hand through his hair. "You negotiated for my life, Margaret. You stood between me and a man who wanted me dead. How am I supposed to respond to that?" "With gratitude, and then moving on. Not with this, whatever this is. Whatever this is." Jonas vaulted the fence, approaching her with intensity that made her back up against the rails. "This is me trying to respect your wishes while going half-mad wanting you. This is me lying awake at night, 20 feet from your room, imagining what it would be like if this marriage was real. This is me falling in love with a woman who can't decide if she wants me or wants me gone." Margaret's breath caught. "You're not in love with me. You're grateful, maybe attracted, but—" "Don't tell me what I feel," Jonas interrupted. "I've known violence and loss and running for so long I'd forgotten what it was like to want something else. Then I meet you, fierce, capable, beautiful Margaret, who looks at my scars and sees a man instead of a monster, who trusts me enough to fight beside me, who kisses me like she's drowning and I'm air. How could I not fall in love with you?" "Because I'm broken," Margaret said, tears she'd been holding back for days finally spilling over. "Because I'm angry all the time. Because I look at you and feel things I shouldn't feel, want things I shouldn't want, and it makes me hate myself because Thomas deserves better than to be forgotten so quickly." Jonas moved closer, gently wiping her tears with his thumb. "You're not forgetting him. Loving again doesn't diminish what you had with Thomas. It honors it, shows that he taught you how to love, how to be loved. That's a gift, not a betrayal. How can you be so sure?" "Because I've lost people too. My sister, friends in the war, pieces of myself along the way. The dead don't want us to join them, Margaret. They want us to live, to find happiness where we can." Margaret looked up at him, this man who'd entered her life as a stranger and had somehow become essential to it. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I. But maybe we can be scared together." She laughed, watery but genuine. "That's your romantic proposition? Being scared together? Would you prefer poetry? I could probably manage something about your eyes being like prairie grass, green and prone to catching fire." "Exactly, exactly." His hand cupped her cheek. "Margaret, I'm not asking for everything all at once. I'm just asking for a chance to court you properly, or as properly as we can manage given we're already married, to see if what's between us is real or just shared trauma." Margaret leaned into his touch, her resistance crumbling. "And if it is real? Then we make this marriage true in every way. And if it's not, we continue as partners and friends, running this ranch together." "You make it sound simple." "Nothing about this is simple, but complicated doesn't mean impossible." The stallion chose that moment to nudge Margaret's shoulder, apparently deciding she'd passed whatever test he'd been administering. She laughed, the sound breaking the tension. "Even the horse agrees," Jonas said. "That's hardly a ringing endorsement. Horses are terrible judges of character." "They liked me right away." "My point exactly." But she was smiling now, and Jonas was smiling back, and something shifted between them, a wall coming down, a door opening. "All right," Margaret said. "We can try. But slowly. I need time to figure out who I am now. Without Thomas. With you. With all of this. As slow as you need. Jonas promised, though I should mention that the town already thinks we're truly married. Mrs. Patterson cornered me yesterday to give advice about keeping a wife happy. Margaret groaned. What did she say? Something about regular flowers and not tracking mud in the house. Sound advice. You should follow it. Yes, ma'am. That evening they sat on the porch watching the sunset, not touching but closer than they'd been since the kiss. The ranch spread out before them, recovered from the attack, thriving despite everything that had tried to destroy it. I received a letter today, Jonas said, from Morrison. Margaret tensed. What did he want? To inform me that he's calling off any remaining bounties. Also, he included preliminary contracts for the railroad deal. We're going to be very wealthy, Margaret. We? The contracts are in both our names. He insisted, actually. Said you'd earned it. Margaret absorbed this news. Wealth meant security, meant never having to worry about losing the ranch, meant independence. That's unexpected. He also said something else. That his wife would have liked you, that you reminded him of why he fell in love with her, fierce and uncompromising. He compared me to his dead wife? That's oddly touching and deeply unsettling. Jonas laughed. Morrison's a complicated man. Aren't we all? They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear. The night sounds of the ranch surrounded them, horses nickering, cattle lowing, the distant howl of coyotes who'd learned to keep their distance. Jonas, Margaret said suddenly, what would you have done if I'd said no? To trying, to us? He considered. Stayed anyway, if you'd let me. Worked the ranch, helped where I could, been grateful for whatever partnership we could manage. Even if I never loved you back? Even then. This place, this life, it's more than I ever expected to have. And you, even as just a friend and partner, you're extraordinary. That would have been enough. His simple acceptance, his willingness to take whatever she could give without demanding more, paradoxically made her want to give him everything. But she held back, still navigating the complex landscape of her grief and growing feelings. Thomas would have liked you, she said quietly. Once he got past the whole gunslinger thing. You think? You're honest, loyal. You work hard and don't complain. You respect me as an equal. Yes, he would have liked you. High praise. Don't let it go to your head. Too late. I'm already planning to have it engraved on my headstone. Thomas Hale would have liked him. Margaret laughed, really laughed, for the first time since Thomas's death. It felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, a promise that joy was still possible, even after loss. As they prepared to go inside, Jonas paused. Margaret, I want you to know, whatever happens between us, however this develops, I'll never try to replace Thomas or make you forget him. He's part of your story, part of what made you who you are. I respect that. Thank you, she managed past the tightness in her throat. That night, Margaret lay awake thinking about paths not taken and roads stretching ahead. She'd married Jonas Reed to save her ranch, a practical decision born of desperate circumstances. But somewhere between the forced vows and the genuine partnership, between the shared danger and the unexpected tenderness, something real had taken root. She thought about Thomas, wondering what he would say about all of this. Knowing him, he'd probably make some joke about her always landing on her feet, about her inability to do anything the simple way. He'd worried about her being alone after he was gone, had made her promise to remarry if something happened to him. She'd laughed it off then, unable to imagine a world without him. Now she was living in that world, and against all odds, she was finding reasons to keep going. Jonas Reed, with his scars and shadows, his steady strength and surprising gentleness, was becoming one of those reasons. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret? Jonas's voice was concerned. I heard you moving around. Are you all right? She opened the door to find him in the hallway, looking rumpled and worried. I'm fine. Just thinking. About? Everything, nothing, the strangeness of life. He leaned against the doorframe, careful not to cross the threshold of her room. It is strange. A month ago, I was a drifter with nothing but a horse and a past I couldn't shake. Now I'm a married rancher negotiating with railroad barons.
Life comes at you fast out here. That it does. He studied her face in the lamplight. You've been crying. She touched her cheek, finding it damp. I didn't realize. Do you want to talk about it? I don't know what I'd say. I'm sad and happy and scared and hopeful all at once. I feel like I'm betraying Thomas by moving forward, but I know staying still will kill me. I want you, but I'm terrified of wanting you. Nothing makes sense. Jonas reached out, slowly enough that she could pull back, and took her hand. Maybe sense is overrated. Maybe we just take it day by day, feeling by feeling, until it does make sense. And if it never does? Then we'll have had the journey. Margaret squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. Will you sit with me for a while? Just sit. I'm not ready for more, but I don't want to be alone. Of course. They sat on the floor of her room, backs against the bed, not speaking but holding hands. It was intimate without being sexual, comforting without demands. Margaret found herself leaning against Jonas's shoulder, feeling his warmth, listening to his breathing. Tell me something about your sister, she said. Something happy. Jonas was quiet for a moment, then. She loved thunderstorms. Used to drag me out onto the porch to watch them roll in. Said they were God's way of reminding us how small we were, but in a good way. Made our problems seem smaller too. She sounds wise. She was 8. He laughed softly. But yes, wise for her years. She would have loved this place, the openness of it. She always felt trapped in towns. Like you. Like me, he agreed. Maybe that's why I kept moving west. Looking for the kind of sky she would have loved. They talked quietly through the night, sharing stories of loss and survival, of dreams deferred and unexpected joys. As dawn crept through the windows, Margaret found herself still leaning against Jonas, their hands still entwined. We should probably get up, she said without moving. The hands will talk if they see you leaving my room. Let them talk. We're married, remember? Married, but maintaining separate rooms. That was our agreement. Jonas turned to look at her. Maybe it's time to renegotiate that agreement. Jonas? I'm not suggesting anything improper. But this, talking, being close, supporting each other, this is what marriage should be, isn't it? Partnership in all things? Margaret considered this. You're suggesting we share a room? Platonically? I'm suggesting we stop fighting what's already happening between us. We don't have to rush anything physical, but this distance we're maintaining, it's not protecting us from feelings. It's just making us miserable. She knew he was right. The careful boundaries they'd established were already dissolving, worn away by shared experience and growing affection. The town would talk even more if we suddenly started sharing a room. Since when do you care what the town thinks? It was a fair point. Margaret had stopped caring about the town's opinion the day they'd tried to force her into marriage. Although, she reflected with dark humor, they'd succeeded in that, just not in the way they'd expected. All right, she said, surprising herself. But you're still sleeping on the daybed. For now, Jonas agreed with a smile that made her heart skip. Don't push your luck, Mr. Reed. Wouldn't dream of it, Mrs. Reed. The decision to share a room changed everything and nothing all at once. Jonas moved his few belongings from the study that very morning, setting up the daybed near the window while Margaret watched from the doorway, her arms crossed as if holding herself together. The hands noticed, of course. Pete gave Jonas a knowing look when they gathered for the morning's work assignments, but said nothing. The younger hands whispered among themselves until Pete's sharp glare silenced them. We'll be moving the herd to the south pasture today, Pete announced, his tone brooking no discussion of anything but ranch business. Ground's better there after all that rain. Margaret threw herself into work with renewed intensity, as if constant motion could quiet the tumult in her chest. She rode out with the hands to help move the cattle, her presence causing some raised eyebrows but no comments. Jonas worked alongside her, their horses moving in unconscious synchronization as they guided the herd across the grassland. You sit a horse well, Jonas observed during a brief rest, watching as Margaret controlled her mount with subtle shifts of weight and pressure. Thomas taught me, she said automatically, then caught herself. Well, he refined what I already knew. I grew up riding in Missouri. Missouri?
Jonas's interest sharpened. What part? Just outside Independence. My father ran a small farm there before the war changed everything. She paused, lost in memory. He died at Wilson's Creek. My mother lasted 2 more years before grief took her too. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Margaret adjusted her hat against the afternoon sun. That's where I met Thomas, actually. He was passing through, working as a deputy marshal. He came to the farm to investigate some stolen horses, stayed for supper, and somehow never quite left. Jonas smiled at that. Thomas always did have good timing. He said I was the first person he'd met who could match him for stubbornness. Margaret's expression softened at the memory. We argued for 3 straight hours about the best way to break a young horse. He finally proposed just to get me to stop talking long enough for him to kiss me. Did it work? For about 10 seconds. Then I told him his kissing needed as much work as his horse training ideas. Jonas laughed, the sound rich and genuine. And he still married you after that? He said he'd rather spend his life arguing with someone interesting than agreeing with someone boring. The smile faded from her face. I miss arguing with him. Isn't that strange? Of all the things to miss, not strange at all. The arguments meant you both cared enough to fight for your opinions. Jonas guided his horse closer to hers. Margaret, you don't have to stop talking about him, not for my sake. Doesn't it bother you? Hearing about the man whose place you've taken? I haven't taken his place. I couldn't if I tried. I'm just making my own place, alongside his memory. Before Margaret could respond, one of the younger hands called out in alarm. A group of riders was approaching from the east, moving fast. Everyone's hands went to their weapons, still jumpy from Morrison's visit. But as the riders drew closer, Margaret recognized the lead figure and groaned. It's Reverend Mills, with what looks like half the church congregation. Indeed, the Reverend rode at the head of a dozen townspeople, their faces set in expressions of righteous determination. They reined up just short of the working party, dust swirling around them like manufactured drama. Mrs. Reed, the Reverend intoned, his voice carrying that particular quality of condemnation wrapped in concern that religious authorities had perfected over centuries. We've come to discuss the scandalous rumors reaching town. Which rumors would those be, Reverend? Margaret asked wearily. There are so many I lose track. The rumors that you and Mr. Reed are now cohabitating, sharing living quarters in a manner that suggests, he paused delicately, impropriety. Jonas moved his horse between Margaret and the Reverend, his expression darkening. We're married, Reverend. Legal and binding. What we do in our own home is our business. A forced marriage, Mr. Reed, hardly sanctified in the eyes of God. And now, barely 2 weeks after poor Thomas's death, you're carrying on as if what? Margaret's voice cut through his sermoning like a blade. As if we're trying to make the best of an impossible situation? As if we're 2 people finding comfort in companionship? As if we're married, which, let me remind you, is exactly what you and the rest of the town demanded. Mrs. Patterson, riding beside the Reverend, clutched her pearls. But, Margaret, dear, the appearance of it. People are saying you've forgotten Thomas already, that you're acting like a common Choose your next word very carefully, Mrs. Patterson, Jonas warned, his hand moving to rest on his gun. The gesture wasn't lost on the congregation, several of whom shifted nervously in their saddles. There's no need for threats, Mr. Reed, Reverend Mills said, though his voice had lost some of its thunderous quality. We're simply concerned Christians looking after one of our flock. Your concern is noted and unwelcome, Margaret said flatly. I don't recall asking for your guidance, Reverend. In fact, I distinctly remember you telling me that a woman should submit to her husband's will. Well, this is my husband, she gestured to Jonas, and his will is that we share a home like married people do. Are you now advising me to defy my husband? The Reverend's face reddened. That's not... You're twisting my words. I'm following them to their logical conclusion. You can't have it both ways, Reverend. Either I'm a properly submissive wife doing as my husband wishes, or I'm an independent woman making my own choices. Which would you prefer? The theological trap she'd set was obvious to everyone, and several of the congregants had the grace to look embarrassed. Pete and the hands were trying not to laugh, their faces carefully neutral but their eyes dancing with amusement. Perhaps, one of the other church members ventured, Mr. Dalton who ran the bank. We've overstepped. Mrs. Reed, Margaret, we're simply concerned. This has all happened so fast, and with Mr. Reed's background ... My background, Jonas said evenly, includes defending this ranch from raiders, protecting the woman you all claim to want protected, and trying to build something decent despite everyone's determination to see me as nothing but a killer. If the shoe fits, someone muttered from the back of the group. Jonas started forward, but Margaret caught his arm. Don't. They're not worth it. Listen to your wife, Reed. Jake Murphy's voice came from behind the church group. He and his brothers had apparently decided to join the impromptu inquisition. Though I'm surprised she can stand to have you in her bed, knowing what you are. The crude insinuation was too much. Margaret dismounted in one fluid motion, striding toward Jake with such fury that his horse actually backed up a step. You pathetic, whiskey-soaked excuse for a man, she said, her voice low and dangerous. You come to my land, insult my husband, and dare to speculate about my bed? You, who've spent more nights in the saloon than in church, who've never built anything but debt and disappointment. Now see here, Jake began. No, you see. Jonas Reed has shown me more respect and genuine care in 2 weeks than you showed in all your pushy, entitled courtship attempts. He works this land, protects it, treats me as an equal partner. You? You saw me as something to own, a prize to be won. The difference between you and him is that he sees me as a person, while you only ever saw property with nice packaging. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake's face had gone from red to purple, his brothers tensing for potential violence. But it was Jonas who broke the standoff, dismounting to stand beside Margaret. I think you all should leave, he said quietly. Now. This isn't over, Jake snarled. You've made enemies here, both of you. Good, Margaret said. I prefer enemies to false friends. At least with enemies, you know where you stand. As the group dispersed, Reverend Mills lingered for a moment. Mrs. Reed, I'll pray for your soul. Pray for your own, Reverend. Mine's doing just fine. When they were gone, Pete let out a low whistle. That was something, Mrs. Reed. Haven't seen Jake Murphy put in his place like that since, well, ever. He had it coming, one of the younger hands added. Been strutting around town like he owned everything in sight. Margaret suddenly felt exhausted, the confrontation draining her of the righteous anger that had sustained her. Jonas's hand found her elbow, steadying her. Let's head back, he said quietly. The herd can wait. They rode back to the ranch house in silence, the hands tactfully continuing with the cattle drive. Once inside, Margaret slumped into a chair at the kitchen table, her hands shaking slightly. That was brave, Jonas said, pouring her a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. Also possibly foolish. Jake Murphy's not the forgiving type. Neither am I. She accepted the coffee gratefully. I'm so tired of it all, Jonas. The judgment, the scrutiny, the constant need to justify my existence to people who contribute nothing to it. You don't owe them anything. No, but they'll make our lives miserable if we don't at least pretend to care about their opinions. Jonas sat across from her, his own cup cradled in his scarred hands. Is that what we're doing? Pretending? Margaret met his eyes. I don't know anymore. Everything feels both real and unreal at the same time. This marriage, this partnership, these feelings I'm developing for you. I can't tell what's genuine and what's just survival instinct. Does it matter? If it helps us survive, if it brings some happiness or comfort, does it matter why it started? Thomas would have said it matters. He was big on truth, on knowing yourself and your motivations. And what would he say now? Margaret considered this. He'd probably tell me to stop overthinking and start living. He was also big on practical action over philosophical hand-wringing. Smart man. He was. She paused, then added quietly, You are too, in a different way. Thomas was book smart, educated. You're life smart, educated by experience. That's a kind way of saying I'm an uneducated gunslinger. That's an accurate way of saying you've learned things that can't be taught in schools. Margaret reached across the table, covering his hand with hers.
You've learned how to survive, how to read danger, how to protect what matters. You've learned when to fight and when to negotiate. Those are valuable skills, Jonas. Don't diminish them. He turned his hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. You're defending me now? Someone has to. You're terrible at defending yourself with words. You just glower and let people think the worst. Maybe I want them to think the worst. Keeps them at distance. And is that what you want?
Distance? Jonas's thumb stroked across her knuckles. Not from you. Not anymore. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Then Margaret's stomach growled loudly, breaking the tension. They both laughed. When did you last eat? Jonas asked. This morning, I think. Maybe yesterday. The days blur together. That's no good. You need to keep your strength up. He stood, moving to the stove. I'll make something. You cook? Army taught me the basics. Don't expect anything fancy, but I can manage edible. Margaret watched as he moved around the kitchen with surprising efficiency, cutting bacon, cracking eggs, slicing bread. There was something deeply domestic about the scene, something that made her chest ache with a combination of loss and longing. Thomas couldn't cook to save his life, she said. He once tried to make breakfast and somehow burned water. How do you burn water? He forgot he'd put it on to boil, let the pot run dry, and melted the bottom clean off. She smiled at the memory. I banned him from the kitchen after that. Probably wise. Jonas plated the food and set it before her. Eat. The simple meal was surprisingly good, and Margaret found herself ravenous once she started eating. Jonas sat beside her with his own plate, their elbows occasionally brushing. Can I ask you something? Margaret said between bites. Anything. Do you really think you could be happy here? Not just safe or settled, but happy? This life, this ranch, it's hard work, repetitive, often boring. It's not the adventure you're probably used to. Jonas set down his fork, considering. You know what I thought about most while I was running? Not adventure or excitement. I thought about sitting still, about having a reason to stay in one place, to see the same sunrise from the same window more than once, about knowing where I'd be in a week, a month, a year. He looked around the kitchen, taking in the details, the worn but clean surfaces, the dishes neatly stacked, the view of the ranch through the window. This is more than I let myself dream of. A home, work that matters, someone who sees me as more than just my worst moments. So yes, Margaret, I could be happy here. I think I already am, or at least heading in that direction. Even with the town treating you like a pariah, the town's opinion matters less to me than yours. If you can tolerate my presence, eventually even welcome it, then the rest is just noise. Margaret studied his face, seeing sincerity in his dark eyes. I more than tolerate your presence, Jonas. I think I might actually be starting to depend on it. Is that so terrible? For someone who's prided herself on independence? Yes, it's terrifying. Independence doesn't mean isolation, Margaret. Even Thomas knew that. That's why he married you, brought you out here with him. He knew that partnership makes both people stronger, not weaker. Before Margaret could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Through the window, she could see Pete riding hard toward the house, his face grim. Jonas was already moving, checking his gun as he headed for the door. Margaret followed, her own weapon ready. What is it? Jonas called as Pete reined up. Trouble in town. Jake Murphy's been shooting his mouth off at the saloon, getting folks riled up. He's saying Reed compromised you before the marriage. That's why you're defending him. Saying Thomas would be ashamed. Margaret's fury was white-hot and immediate. That bastard! There's more, Pete continued. He's gathering men, talking about riding out here to defend your honor, whether you want it or not. The sheriff from Fort Morgan happened to be in town, and he's trying to calm things down, but Jake's got the mob worked up, Jonas finished. How many? Maybe 15, 20 men, most of them drunk. Jonas turned to Margaret. You should go. Take the best horse, ride for Fort Morgan. I'll handle this. We've had this conversation before. I'm not running from my own home. Margaret, a mob's different from a few hired guns. They're unpredictable, feeding off each other's anger and liquor, and they think they're righteous, which makes them more dangerous. All the more reason I need to be here. They're using my name, my reputation, as an excuse for violence. I won't let that stand. Pete looked between them. The boys are ready to fight if it comes to that. But Mrs. Reed, maybe if you talk to them, told them nothing improper happened. I'll tell them nothing because I owe them nothing, Margaret said firmly. My relationship with my husband is my business. Then we prepare for a siege, Jonas said grimly. Pete, bring everyone in from the range. Fortify the positions we used against Morrison's men. As Pete rode off to gather the hands, Jonas and Margaret stood on the porch, looking toward town where dust suggested movement, preparation. This is my fault, Jonas said quietly. My past, my reputation. It's poisoning everything. No, this is Jake Murphy's bruised ego and the town's narrow-minded prudishness. You're just the convenient excuse. If I left, then they'd find another reason to come after me. A woman with land and no man to control her? I'd be a target regardless. She turned to face him. We stand together, Jonas. That's what marriage means, forced or not. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. Together. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked too much like fire, they could see the mob approaching, not riding hard like Morrison's professional guns, but moving with the inexorable momentum of accumulated rage and righteous fury. At their head rode Jake Murphy, and beside him, to Margaret's surprise and disappointment, Reverend Mills. So much for Christian charity, she muttered. The mob stopped just outside rifle range, their torches beginning to flicker to life in the gathering dusk. Jake rode forward with the Reverend and 3 other men. Margaret Hale, Jake called out, using her maiden name deliberately. We've come to free you from this forced arrangement. My name is Margaret Reed, she called back, stepping out where they could see her clearly. And the only force being applied here is by you. Don't protect him out of fear, Reverend Mills added. We know what kind of man he is. We're here to help. Help? Margaret laughed bitterly. Where was this help when I was forced to marry to keep my land? Where was this help when Thomas lay dying in the street? You only want to help when it gives you an excuse for violence. We're trying to save you from a killer, Jake insisted. You're trying to save your pride from the fact that I chose him over you, Margaret countered. Even forced to marry, I chose Jonas Reed over you, Jake Murphy, and I'd make the same choice freely now. The words hung in the air, shocking in their clarity. Jonas looked at her sharply, but she kept her eyes on the mob. You don't mean that, Jake said, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. He's corrupted you, turned you against decent folk. Decent folk? Margaret's voice rose. Decent folk who treat widows like property? Who spread gossip and lies? Who form mobs to attack innocent people? If that's decency, I want no part of it. She felt Jonas move beside her, his hand finding hers. The gesture wasn't lost on the crowd, several of whom muttered angrily. Last warning, Reed, Jake called out. Leave now, and we'll let you go. Stay, and we'll burn you out. You'll try, Jonas replied calmly. The sheriff from Fort Morgan chose that moment to arrive, riding hard with 2 deputies. He positioned himself between the mob and the ranch. That's enough, he commanded. Everyone stand down. This isn't your jurisdiction, Sheriff, Jake protested. A mob threatening violence? That's everyone's jurisdiction. The sheriff looked at the assembled crowd. You all have families, businesses, reputations. You really want to throw all that away for one man's wounded pride? It's about justice, Reverend Mills insisted, about protecting a woman's virtue. Mrs. Reed seems capable of protecting her own virtue, the sheriff observed dryly. And last I checked, she's a grown woman who can make her own choices. But the marriage was forced by the law. The same law you're now breaking by forming this mob. The sheriff's hand rested on his gun. Disperse now, or I'll arrest the lot of you. For a moment, the situation balanced on a knife's edge. Then slowly men began to peel away from the back of the mob. The fever was breaking, replaced by the cold realization of consequences. Jake Murphy was the last to leave, pointing at Jonas as he turned his horse. This isn't over, Reed. Not by a long shot. After they were gone, the sheriff approached the house. Mrs. Reed, Mr. Reed, you all right? We're fine, Sheriff. Thank you for your intervention. The sheriff, a weathered man named Coleman, studied them both. That was a brave thing you said out there, Mrs. Reed, about choosing your husband. Not many women would stand up to a mob like that. Not many women have to, Margaret replied. True enough. Coleman tipped his hat. I'll be in town for a few more days. Try to keep the peace until then? After he left, Margaret and Jonas stood on the porch in the gathering darkness. The hands were slowly emerging from their defensive positions, the tension gradually easing. Did you mean it? Jonas asked quietly. What you said about choosing me? Margaret turned to face him, seeing hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. I meant it. If I had to choose again, knowing everything I know now, I'd choose you. Why? Because you see me, Jonas. Not as a widow to be pitied or a woman to be controlled, but as myself. Because you're willing to stand beside me instead of in front of me. Because despite everything you've been through, you're still capable of kindness. Margaret, he began, but she pressed her fingers to his lips. And because when you look at me, I remember that I'm more than just my grief. I'm still capable of feeling things beyond pain and anger. Jonas caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. What do you feel? Terrified, she admitted, but also alive. For the first time since Thomas died, I feel alive. He pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to cup her cheek. I love you, Margaret. I know it's too soon, too complicated, but I need you to know. She silenced him with a kiss, different from their first. This wasn't desperation or accident, but choice, deliberate and conscious. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Margaret rested her forehead against his. I'm not ready to say it back, she whispered. But I'm feeling something, Jonas. Something real and strong and frightening. That's enough, he said. More than enough. That night they lay in their separate beds in the same room, the darkness filled with new awareness. Margaret could hear Jonas's breathing, could sense his presence across the room. It was torture and comfort simultaneously. Jonas? She said into the darkness. Yes? Tell me about your dreams, not your past, not your regrets, your dreams for the future. He was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep. Then, I dream about waking up without checking for threats. About building something that lasts, maybe expanding the barn, adding a proper study to the house. I dream about teaching our children to ride, to shoot, to be strong and independent like their mother. Children? The word caught her off guard. Someday, if you want, we're young enough still, and this ranch needs heirs to carry it forward. Margaret had avoided thinking about children since Thomas's death, the possibility too painful to contemplate. But now, with Jonas's quiet voice painting pictures in the darkness, she could almost see it. Small faces with his dark eyes and her stubborn chin running through the prairie grass. That's a dangerous dream, she said softly. All the best dreams are. She turned onto her side, able to make out his silhouette in the moonlight filtering through the window. What if I can't love you the way you deserve? What if I'm too broken, too changed by loss? Then we'll work with what we have. Love isn't always grand passion, Margaret. Sometimes it's just two people choosing each other, day after day, building something together. Is that enough for you? You're enough for me, however you come to me. The simple acceptance in his words broke something open in her chest. Tears came then, silent in the darkness, for Thomas, for herself, for the unexpected grace of finding something good in the midst of so much pain. She heard Jonas shift, probably fighting the urge to comfort her. It's all right, she managed. These are complicated tears. The best kind, he said gently. They talked through the night again, sharing smaller dreams and larger fears. Jonas told her about wanting to plant an orchard on the South Hill, about his ideas for improving the irrigation from Willow Creek. Margaret shared her plans for selective breeding of their cattle, about her correspondence with a rancher in Texas who'd developed a hardier strain. As dawn approached, Margaret made a decision. She rose from her bed and crossed the room, standing beside Jonas's daybed. Move over, she said. His eyes widened. Margaret, just to sleep. I'm tired of being alone, and I'm tired of pretending I don't want to be near you. He shifted, making room for her on the narrow bed. She lay down beside him, her back to his chest, his arm coming around her waist. It was innocent but intimate, crossing a line they'd carefully maintained. "Is this all right?" he asked, his breath warm against her hair. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. They slept then, deeply and peacefully, as the sun rose over their ranch. When Pete knocked on the door hours later with news that needed their attention, he found them still entwined, fully clothed, but clearly together. "Sorry to disturb," he said, though his eyes were warm with approval. "But we've got a situation." They rose quickly, embarrassment and something else, contentment maybe, passing between them. "What kind of situation?" Jonas asked, immediately alert. "Good kind, actually. There's a cattle buyer from Denver at the door. Says he heard about our operation from Morrison, wants to negotiate a contract for next season." Margaret and Jonas exchanged glances. Business was moving forward, life was continuing despite everything that had tried to stop it. "We'll be right down," Margaret said. As Pete left, she and Jonas stood looking at each other, disheveled from sleep, caught between their separate beds and shared future. "No regrets?" Jonas asked. "None," Margaret said firmly. "We face this together." "Together," he agreed and offered her his arm. They descended the stairs as a united front, ready to negotiate with cattle buyers and face whatever the day might bring. The ghost of Thomas seemed to nod approval from the corners of Margaret's memory. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but no longer a barrier to moving forward. Outside, the ranch was waking up, hands going about their morning chores, cattle lowing in the distance, the endless prairie stretching toward mountains that caught the morning light. It was a hard life, an uncertain life, but it was theirs to build together. The cattle buyer turned out to be a shrewd negotiator named Wilson, but Margaret matched him point for point while Jonas provided strategic silences that somehow added weight to her arguments. By noon, they'd secured a contract that would guarantee the ranch's prosperity for years to come. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mrs. Reed," Wilson said, shaking her hand. "And you, Mr. Reed." Morrison was right. You two make a formidable team. After he left, Margaret and Jonas stood in the yard, contract in hand, success warm between them. "We did it," Margaret said, slightly stunned. "We actually did it." "You did it." I just glowered in the background. "Your glowering is very effective." She looked up at him, feeling something she hadn't felt in so long. Hope. "Jonas, I think we might actually make this work." "The ranch?" "Everything. The ranch, the partnership, the marriage, all of it." He smiled, the expression transforming his scarred face into something almost beautiful. I never doubted it. "Liar." "Optimist," he corrected. "You make me want to be an optimist, Margaret Reed." She reached up, tracing his scar with familiar fingers. "And you make me want to be brave, Jonas Reed." This time, when they kissed, it was in full view of the ranch hands, the afternoon sun, and the wide prairie sky. Let the town talk, Margaret thought. They'd earned this moment of happiness, bought it with blood and tears and sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. When they broke apart, Pete called out from the barn, "About time!" The other hands cheered and whistled, their approval clear. These men who'd fought beside them, who'd chosen loyalty to the brand over the town's opinion, they understood what this meant. "Back to work, all of you," Jonas called out, but he was smiling. As the hands dispersed, Margaret kept her hand in Jonas's, feeling the calluses that matched her own, the strength that complemented hers. "What now?" she asked. "Now we build a life," Jonas said simply. "Day by day, season by season. We raise cattle, we plant that orchard, we face down whoever needs facing down. We make this marriage real in every way that matters." "And Thomas?" "Will always be part of our story. The man who brought us together, in his own way. I think he'd want us to be happy, don't you?" Margaret thought of Thomas, of his easy laugh and his fierce protection of those he loved. Yes, he would want her to be happy. He would want her to live fully and completely, not just survive. "Yes," she said softly. He would. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret and Jonas sat on their porch watching the day end. The ranch spread before them, hard-won and precious, a kingdom built of grass and determination. "No more separate beds," Margaret said suddenly. Jonas looked at her, surprised. Are you sure? I'm sure I'm tired of pretending we're not already bound together in every way that matters. The physical is just catching up to the rest. Margaret, we don't have to. I know, but I want to. Not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. I want to be your wife in truth, Jonas. I want to stop holding back out of fear or propriety or some misguided loyalty to the past. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing each knuckle reverently. Whenever you're ready. I've waited this long, I can wait longer. Not too much longer, she said, and was rewarded by seeing desire flare in his eyes. The next few days passed in a haze of new intimacy and careful exploration. They shared the bed now, though still fully clothed, learning the rhythm of each other's sleep, the way Jonas muttered sometimes in his dreams, the way Margaret curled into his warmth without waking. It was domestic and tender in ways neither had expected. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Jonas woke first, as had become his habit, content to lie still with Margaret in his arms, watching dawn creep through their window. She stirred against him, murmuring something unintelligible before her eyes opened. "Morning," she said sleepily, then seemed to realize their position, her head on his chest, his fingers tangled in her unbound hair. But instead of pulling away as she might have done even a week ago, she pressed closer. "Storm coming," Jonas said, feeling the pressure change in the air. "Let it come," Margaret replied. "We've weathered worse. But this storm would prove different from any they'd faced before." It started with the horses. Pete found Jonas in the barn, his expression grim. Something spooked them bad. "They won't settle. Keep pulling toward the gate like they want to run." Jonas studied the animals, noting their rolling eyes, the nervous stamping of hooves. He'd seen this before during the war, when animals sensed danger humans couldn't yet perceive. "Double the watch tonight," he told Pete. "Something's coming." Margaret found them there, having noticed the disturbance from the house. "What is it?" "Don't know yet," Jonas admitted. "But the horses know something we don't." As if in response, thunder rumbled in the distance, though the sky was still clear. Margaret frowned, studying the horizon. "That's not weather." "No," Jonas agreed, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. "That's riders. A lot of them." They didn't have long to wait. Within an hour, a dust cloud appeared on the eastern horizon, too large to be Morrison's men returning or Jake Murphy's mob reforming. This was something else, something bigger. "Get everyone to defensive positions," Jonas ordered Pete. "But don't shoot unless they make the first move." "We don't know who they are yet." As the riders approached, their identity became clear, and Jonas's face went white beneath his tan. At the head of the column rode a man in a federal marshal's badge, and beside him, a woman in traveling clothes who bore a striking resemblance to Jonas himself. "Sarah?" Jonas breathed, and Margaret felt her heart stop. "Your sister? But you said she was dead." "She was. I mean, I saw the grave, the death certificate." Jonas seemed to shake himself, wariness replacing shock. "Stay back, Margaret. This could be a trap." But Margaret was already moving forward, her mind racing. If this woman was truly Jonas's sister, alive against all probability, it changed everything. And if she wasn't, if this was some elaborate scheme by Morrison or another enemy, they needed to know quickly. The riders stopped at the ranch's boundary, the marshal raising his hand in a gesture of peace. "Jonas Reed," he called out. "I'm Federal Marshal Thompson. I have someone here who claims to be your sister." The woman dismounted, moving forward slowly. As she came closer, Margaret could see the resemblance was undeniable, the same dark eyes, the same determined set to the jaw, though her face was unscarred, softer. "Jonas?" she said, and her voice broke on his name. "It's really me. I know you thought I was dead, but I can explain everything." Jonas stood frozen, his hand still on his gun. "Sarah died 3 years ago. I saw the certificate, spoke to the doctor." "The doctor who was paid by Samuel Morrison to lie," Sarah interrupted. "Just like he paid to fake my death, to have me held in a sanatorium in Kansas, to use me as bait to draw you out." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Morrison's easy acceptance of Margaret's terms, his sudden withdrawal, he'd been playing a longer game. "Morrison," Jonas said, the name like poison on his tongue. This is his doing. Marshal Thompson dismounted as well. Mr. Reed, I need you to listen carefully. We've been investigating Morrison for years. Extortion, false imprisonment, murder for hire. Your sister's testimony has finally given us what we need to bring him down, but we need your cooperation. My cooperation? Jonas laughed bitterly. You mean you want me to be bait? We want you to help us end this, the marshal corrected. Morrison's on his way here with hired guns, planning to finish what he started, but this time we'll be ready for him. Margaret stepped forward, placing herself partially between Jonas and these newcomers. How do we know you're really a federal marshal? How do we know any of this is true? Thompson pulled out his credentials, official documents bearing federal seals. Ma'am, I understand your suspicion, but we don't have much time. Morrison's maybe a day behind us, and he's bringing an army. Margaret, Sarah said, focusing on her for the first time. You're his wife. The one who negotiated with Morrison, who made him back down. There was admiration in her voice. He talked about you, said you were formidable. Morrison talked to you. Gloated is more accurate. He kept me informed of everything. Jonas running, fighting, surviving. He wanted me to know my brother was suffering because of me. Sarah's voice hardened. He underestimated how much I'm my brother's sister. I survived too, waited for my chance, and when it came, I took it. Jonas finally moved, stepping toward Sarah with agonizing slowness. The birthmark, he said suddenly, behind your left ear, shaped like a crescent moon. Sarah turned her head, lifting her hair to reveal exactly what Jonas had described. You used to say it meant I was marked by God for something special, she said softly. I held on to that during the worst times. Jonas's control shattered. He crossed the remaining distance in 2 strides, pulling Sarah into an embrace that looked almost painful in its intensity. I mourned you, Margaret heard him say. For 3 years, I carried your death like a stone. I know, Sarah whispered back. I'm so sorry, Jonas. I'm so sorry for all of it. Margaret watched them, feeling like an intruder on this private moment of reunion, but unable to look away. This changed everything, their careful balance, their growing intimacy, their plans for the future. Jonas had his family back, or at least part of it. Where did that leave her? Mrs. Reed, Marshal Thompson said, drawing her attention. We need to discuss defensive preparations. Morrison won't care that we're here. If anything, our presence will make him more determined. How many men does he have? Margaret asked, forcing herself to focus on practical matters. At least 30, possibly more. All professional guns. We have 8 ranch hands, plus Jonas and myself. You? 4 deputies already in position around the property. Thompson studied her. You fought before. I've defended what's mine before. There's a difference. Not in the outcome. Sarah and Jonas approached then, his arm protective around his sister's shoulders. Margaret, Jonas began, but she could see the conflict in his eyes, joy at Sarah's survival warring with fear for Margaret's safety. We need to get Sarah inside, Margaret said briskly, not ready to deal with the emotional complexities yet. And we need to prepare. Marshal, I assume you have a plan beyond just waiting for Morrison to attack. We need Jonas to draw him out, Thompson admitted. Morrison's smart, careful, but his hatred for your husband makes him vulnerable. If Jonas challenges him directly, publicly, he'll respond. Absolutely not, Margaret said immediately. Jonas isn't bait. Margaret, Jonas started. No. We just went through this with his first attack, with Jake Murphy's mob. How many times does Jonas have to risk his life before this ends? Until Morrison's dead or in custody, Thompson said bluntly. That's the reality, Mrs. Reed. Morrison won't stop. Even if we weren't here, even if you hadn't known about Sarah, he would keep coming. Sarah spoke up then. There's something else. Morrison, he has documents, proof that the judge who ordered your marriage was paid off, that the whole thing was orchestrated to get Jonas in one place, vulnerable. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. What? Morrison wanted Jonas to suffer, Sarah explained. He knew about Thomas's death, about the law regarding widows. He paid Judge Morrison, their distant cousins, to insist on the marriage, to choose Jonas specifically. So our marriage, Margaret couldn't finish the sentence, is built on a lie, Jonas said quietly, on manipulation. The ground seemed to shift beneath Margaret's feet. Everything, their forced union, their growing feelings, their shared struggles, all of it had been orchestrated by the man who wanted Jonas dead. No, she said firmly, surprising herself with her vehemence. Our marriage might have been manipulated into being, but what we've built since then is real. Morrison might have forced us together, but he didn't make us choose each other. We did that ourselves. Jonas looked at her with something like wonder. You can forgive this? That our entire relationship is based on Morrison's scheme? Our relationship is based on respect, partnership, and growing love, Margaret countered. Morrison might have provided the circumstances, but we provided everything else. Sarah watched this exchange with interest. You love him. It wasn't a question. Margaret met her gaze steadily. I'm learning to... And you? Sarah asked Jonas. Do you love her? More than my own life, Jonas said without hesitation. Then Morrison's plan backfired, Sarah said with grim satisfaction. He wanted to isolate you, make you vulnerable. Instead, he gave you an ally, a partner, something worth fighting for. Marshal Thompson cleared his throat. Touching as this is, we need to focus on survival first, romance later. Morrison will be here by tomorrow night. We need a plan. They spent the rest of the day in preparation. Sarah was settled in the house, armed despite Jonas's protests. The ranch hands were briefed and positioned. The federal deputies revealed themselves, taking strategic positions around the property. As night fell, Margaret found herself alone with Jonas on the porch, their first real moment of privacy since Sarah's arrival. Everything's changed, she said unnecessarily. Has it? Jonas asked. The threat's the same. Morrison wants me dead. The only difference is now we know why and how far he's willing to go. You have your sister back. That changes things. Jonas turned to face her fully. It doesn't change how I feel about you, if that's what you're worried about. Doesn't it? She's your family, your real family. I'm just a forced arrangement that happened to work out. Jonas caught her shoulders, his grip firm but gentle. You're my wife. My partner. The woman I love. Sarah being alive is a miracle I never expected, but it doesn't diminish what we have. How can you be sure? Because when I thought I might lose you to Morrison's schemes or Murphy's mob, I felt like I was dying. Because when you stood up and claimed me in front of the town, I felt more valued than I have in years. Because when I wake up with you in my arms, I think maybe all the running and fighting was worth it if it led me to you. Margaret felt tears threaten. Jonas? He kissed her then, deep and desperate, as if trying to pour all his feelings into the contact. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. Morrison might have forced us together, but I would choose you freely now, Margaret Reed. 1,000 times over, I would choose you. Even with all this danger, all this complexity, especially with it. You make me brave enough to face it instead of running. A sound from inside made them pull apart. Sarah stood in the doorway, looking apologetic. Sorry to interrupt, but the marshal wants to go over the plan once more. They gathered in the parlor, Jonas, Margaret, Sarah, Marshal Thompson, and Pete representing the ranch hands. The plan was simple in its audacity. At dawn, Jonas will ride out alone, seemingly fleeing, Thompson explained. Morrison will follow, thinking he's vulnerable. Once they're in Serpent's Canyon, we spring the trap. That canyon's a death trap, Pete protested. One way in, one way out. Exactly, Thompson said. Morrison will think he has Jonas cornered. He won't expect us to be waiting on the ridges. It's too dangerous, Margaret said. Too many things could go wrong. Everything about this is dangerous, Jonas pointed out. But it's better than waiting here, turning the ranch into a battlefield again. I'm going with you, Margaret said. No, Jonas and Thompson said simultaneously. I'm the best shot on this ranch besides Jonas, Margaret argued. And I know that canyon better than anyone. I've hunted there since Thomas and I first arrived. It's too dangerous, Jonas began. Everything's dangerous, Margaret threw his words back at him. But we face it together, remember? That's what we promised. Sarah spoke up unexpectedly. She should go. Morrison won't expect it. He thinks women are weak, controllable. It's why he held me instead of killing me. Why he thought forcing Jonas into marriage would break him. Margaret's presence will throw him off. I don't like it, Jonas said. You don't have to like it, Margaret replied. You just have to trust me. They argued for another hour, but eventually, practicality won. Margaret knew the terrain, could shoot, and had proven herself in battle. She would take position on the ridge with the deputies while Jonas played bait below. That night, their last before the confrontation, Margaret and Jonas lay together in their bed, both fully dressed and armed, unable to sleep. If something happens tomorrow, Jonas began. Nothing will happen, Margaret interrupted. We're going to win. Morrison will be arrested or dead, and we'll come home to start that orchard you keep talking about. Margaret, be realistic. She turned in his arms to face him. No, I've been realistic for weeks. Tonight, I want to be hopeful. I want to believe that tomorrow we'll be free of this, that we'll have a future without constantly looking over our shoulders. And if we don't? Then at least we'll have had tonight. She kissed him then, different from before, slower, deeper, with intention rather than desperation. Jonas responded immediately, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling her closer. Margaret, he breathed against her lips. Are you sure? I'm sure that I love you, she said, the words coming easier than expected. I'm sure that I want you. I'm sure that if we die tomorrow, I don't want to die with regrets. You love me? God help me, yes. Despite everything, because of everything, I love you, Jonas Reed. He rolled them so she was beneath him, his weight a welcome pressure. Say it again. I love you. Again? I love you, you impossible man. He kissed her thoroughly, then pulled back. I love you too, Margaret, more than I have words for. Their coming together was gentle, despite the urgency thrumming through them, careful of each other's scars, both visible and hidden. Margaret had thought she knew what intimacy was from her marriage to Thomas, but this was different, raw and honest and tinged with the possibility of loss. Afterward, they lay entwined, sweat cooling on their skin, listening to each other breathe. Whatever happens tomorrow, Jonas said quietly, this was worth it. You were worth it. Don't talk like that. We're going to survive. But if we don't, then I'll find you in whatever comes after and give you hell for getting us killed. He laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. I believe you would. Count on it. They dozed fitfully, waking often to touch each other, to confirm the other was still there. As dawn approached, they rose and prepared in silence, checking weapons, donning clothes suitable for fighting. Sarah was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and her own rifle. Did you sleep? Margaret asked. No, too many years of captivity make freedom feel fragile. She studied Margaret and Jonas, noting their clasped hands. You've decided to really be married. We decided to choose each other, Margaret corrected. The marriage was just paperwork. Morrison would hate that, Sarah said with satisfaction. His grand plan turned into a love story. Let's make sure we survive to tell it, Jonas said. Marshal Thompson arrived as they were finishing breakfast. Morrison's men were spotted 5 miles out. It's time. Jonas mounted his horse, looking every inch the lone gunslinger he'd been when he arrived in Ironwood Crossing. But Margaret could see the differences, the steadiness in his posture, the purpose in his eyes. He wasn't running anymore. He was leading Morrison into a trap. Be careful, Margaret said, catching his stirrup. You too. He leaned down to kiss her, brief but intense. I love you. I love you too. Now go, before I decide this is a terrible idea and lock you in the barn. He smiled and spurred his horse forward, riding hard toward the canyon. Margaret watched until he was out of sight, then mounted her own horse. The deputies were already in position. Sarah would stay at the ranch with Pete and some of the hands, a last line of defense if things went wrong. The ride to Serpent's Canyon seemed both endless and too quick. Margaret took her position on the southern ridge, checking her rifle, counting ammunition. From here, she could see the canyon floor clearly, could see Jonas positioning himself near the box end, apparently trapped. They didn't have long to wait. Morrison's men poured into the canyon like water finding a channel, confident in their numbers and their quarry's apparent vulnerability. Morrison himself rode in the middle of the pack, protected but visible. Margaret could see Jonas below, standing his ground as 30 armed men surrounded him. Her finger found the trigger, but she waited for the signal. "Jonas Reed," Morrison's voice carried up to the ridges. "Finally run out of places to hide?" "Just tired of running," Jonas called back. "Figured it was time to end this." "Yes," Morrison agreed. "It is." That's when Jonas said the words they'd agreed on, the signal for the trap. "Sarah sends her regards." Morrison's shock was visible even from Margaret's position. "Sarah's dead." "No," Jonas said. "She's very much alive. And she's told the federal marshals everything, about the false imprisonment, the hired killers, the bribes. It's over, Morrison." "You're lying!" Marshal Thompson stood up on the opposite ridge, badge glinting in the morning sun. "Samuel Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy, false imprisonment, attempted murder, and corruption. Order your men to drop their weapons." For a moment, everything hung in balance. Then Morrison laughed, cold and bitter. "You think I care about arrest? About prison? My son is dead because of him." He pointed at Jonas. "Nothing matters except vengeance." "Then you'll die for it," Jonas said quietly. Morrison drew his gun, and chaos erupted. The canyon became a battlefield, gunfire echoing off the walls in deafening cacophony. Margaret picked her targets carefully, men threatening Jonas's position, those trying to flank the deputies. Her rifle cracked again and again, each shot finding its mark. She saw Jonas moving below, using the rocks for cover, his gun speaking death to those who came too close. He fought with the same terrible efficiency she'd witnessed before, but now she understood it differently. This wasn't just violence. It was protection, survival. A man fighting for his future rather than running from his past. A movement to her left caught her attention. Some of Morrison's men had found a path up the ridge, trying to flank her position. Margaret turned, firing rapidly, but there were too many. She was about to be overrun when Sarah appeared, seemingly from nowhere, her rifle cutting down the climbers with precise shots. "Thought you might need help," Sarah called out. "You were supposed to stay at the ranch." "Reed women don't hide when their family's in danger," Sarah replied, and Margaret felt a warm rush at being included in that designation. Together, they held the ridge, sisters-in-law bound by marriage and now by battle. Below, the fight was turning. Morrison's men, caught in the crossfire, were falling or surrendering. But Morrison himself remained standing, protected by his most loyal guards, still focused on Jonas with single-minded hatred. Margaret saw him raising a rifle, drawing a bead on Jonas, who was engaged with 2 other gunmen. Without thinking, she abandoned her covered position, standing fully exposed as she lined up the shot. Morrison saw her at the same moment she fired. His shot went wide as hers found its mark, spinning him around and dropping him to the canyon floor. But one of his guards, seeing Margaret exposed, fired at her. She felt the impact, a punch that drove her backward, and then she was falling, the world spinning as she tumbled down the ridge. "Margaret!" She heard Jonas scream her name, heard continued gunfire, but it all seemed very far away. She came to rest in a painful heap halfway down the slope, her shoulder blazing with pain. Through blurred vision, she saw Jonas reaching her, his hands gentle but urgent as he checked her wound. "Shoulder," he said with relief. "Clean through. You're going to be fine." Morrison? Dead. "It's over, Margaret. It's really over." Around them, the last of Morrison's men were surrendering, the federal marshals taking them into custody. Sarah slid down the slope to join them, her face pale with concern. "Is she... She'll be fine," Jonas said, but his hands were shaking as he pressed his shirt to Margaret's wound to stop the bleeding. "She'll be fine." "Of course I will," Margaret managed. "I promised we'd plant that orchard, didn't I?" Jonas laughed, the sound choked with relief and love. "Yes, you did." Marshal Thompson approached, looking satisfied despite a graze on his cheek. "It's done. Morrison's dead. His organization will crumble without him. You're free, Mr. Reed, both of you." Free. The word echoed in Margaret's mind as Jonas carried her to a wagon for transport back to the ranch. Free from pursuit, from constant vigilance, from the shadow of the past. "What will you do now?" Margaret asked Sarah as they rode back. "Where will you go?" Sarah looked at Jonas, then at Margaret. "I was hoping, if you'll have me, I'd like to stay. At least for a while. I've missed my brother, and I'd like to know my new sister." "Of course you'll stay," Margaret said immediately, then looked at Jonas. "Right?" "As long as you want," Jonas told Sarah, his voice thick with emotion. "This is your home too now." The ranch came into view, and Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Home. Not just a place she was defending, but a true home, with family and love and a future stretching ahead without fear. The wound healing took weeks, during which Margaret chafed at the enforced inactivity while Jonas and Sarah fussed over her. The ranch continued its operations, Pete stepping up to manage things with quiet efficiency. The story of the canyon battle spread through the territory, transforming Jonas from feared gunslinger to hero, and Margaret from forced bride to frontier legend. Jake Murphy, perhaps wisely, sold his holdings and moved east. Reverend Mills delivered a sermon on redemption and second chances that seemed pointed but not unkind. Even Mrs. Patterson brought a cake, acknowledging that she had perhaps misjudged the situation. "People are strange," Margaret mused one evening as she sat on the porch, her arm still in a sling but otherwise recovered. "When we were struggling, they couldn't wait to tear us down. Now that we've survived, they want to claim they supported us all along." "Human nature," Jonas said, sitting beside her. "Everyone loves a winner. Do you feel like a winner?" He looked at her, at Sarah reading in the doorway, at the ranch spreading peaceful in the twilight. "I feel like the richest man in the territory." "The cattle contracts will help with that," Margaret said with deliberate obtuseness. "That's not what I meant." "I know." She leaned against his shoulder. "Jonas, there's something I've been thinking about." "What's that?" "Our marriage. It was forced, arranged under false pretenses, based on Morrison's manipulations." Jonas tensed. "Margaret, if you want to annul it—" "No, you fool. I want to do it again, properly, with Sarah there, and Pete, and anyone else who matters to us. A real wedding, with real vows chosen freely." Jonas turned to stare at her. "You want to marry me again?" "I want to marry you for the first time, really." "The first was just paperwork. This would be us, choosing each other without force or manipulation or threats." "What do you say, Jonas Reed? Will you marry me?" "Every day for the rest of our lives, if you'll let me." Sarah's voice came from the doorway. "That's a yes, Margaret. In case you couldn't tell through all the romantic speech-making." They were married again 2 weeks later, in the ranch yard with the mountains as backdrop. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, finally altered to fit. Jonas wore a new suit, bought specially for the occasion. Sarah stood as witness along with Pete, and even Marshall Thompson returned for the ceremony. This time, when the Reverend said, "You may kiss the bride," Jonas didn't hesitate. He kissed Margaret thoroughly, lifting her off her feet despite her laughing protests about propriety. "Let them talk," he said against her lips. "We've earned this." That night, as they lay in their bed, their true marriage bed now, Margaret traced the scar on Jonas's face one more time. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Coming to Ironwood Crossing? Getting tangled up with me?" "Never," he said without hesitation. "Every scar, every bullet, every hard mile was worth it if it led me here." "Even though it started with Thomas's death?" "Thomas's death was a tragedy, but what we've built from that tragedy, that's a choice. We chose to make something beautiful from something horrible." Margaret considered this. He would have liked that interpretation. Thomas always said the measure of a person wasn't in what happened to them, but in what they did with what happened to them. Smart man. He was. And so are you, in different ways. Different how? Thomas was smart about people, about seeing their better natures and encouraging them. You're smart about survival, about protecting what matters and building despite the odds. And you? "I'm smart enough to have loved you both," Margaret said simply. They made love then, slow and tender, a celebration of survival and choice, and the future they'd fought to claim. Outside, a storm rolled across the prairie, but inside they were safe, warm, together, Later, as Jonas slept beside her, Margaret rose and went to the window. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming with promise. In the distance, she could see the hill where Thomas lay buried, and she felt no guilt, only gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered to his memory, "for loving me, for preparing me, for making me strong enough to love again." The wind sighed through the grass, and for a moment she could almost hear Thomas's laugh, warm and approving. Then Jonas stirred, reaching for her in his sleep, and she returned to bed, to the living, to the future they would build together. A year later, as Margaret stood in the doorway of their expanded house, watching Jonas and Sarah work with a new colt in the corral, she placed a hand on her growing belly. The child within kicked, strong and insistent, and Margaret smiled. They'd planted that orchard Jonas had dreamed of, trees now taking root on the South Hill. The ranch had prospered, the railroad contracts making them wealthy beyond their early dreams. Sarah had found her own happiness with the new sheriff, a kind man who treated her like precious glass until she proved she was stronger than he'd imagined. Pete approached, touching his hat. "Mrs. Reed, the buyers from Chicago are here." "Thank you, Pete. Tell them we'll meet them in the office." As she turned to go inside, Jonas caught up with her, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that had become habitual. "You sure you're up for negotiating? You could rest." "Jonas Reed, I negotiated with Morrison while you were bleeding. I think I can handle some cattle buyers while pregnant." "Just checking." He kissed her temple. "I love you, you know." "I know, I love you too." They walked into their office together, partners in every sense, to face whatever challenges and opportunities the day might bring. Behind them, the ranch stretched out under the endless sky, a kingdom built on love and loss, choice and chance, the forced marriage that had become the truest thing in both their lives. The brooding cowboy and the sheriff's widow had found their happy ending, not in spite of the violence and pain that brought them together, but because they'd chosen to transform that darkness into light, that forced beginning into a chosen future. The prairie had witnessed their first kiss born of desperation, their battles against those who would tear them apart, and now it witnessed their triumph, a love that had grown from the ashes of tragedy, stronger for having been tested, truer for having been chosen. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jonas and Margaret stood together on their porch, her back against his chest, his arms wrapped around her and their unborn child. Sarah sat nearby, working on a letter to her beau, while Pete and the hands went about the evening chores. "No regrets?" Jonas asked, as had become their ritual. "None," Margaret replied, as she always did. "We chose each other." "Every day," he agreed. "Forever," she promised. And there, on the edge of the frontier, in a place where law and love had collided to forge an unexpected future, they kept that promise day after day, season after season, building a life that neither had imagined but both had fought to claim. The forced marriage had become a chosen love, and that love had transformed everything it touched, the ranch, the town, and most of all, the two wounded souls who'd found healing in each other's arms.